The discovery of a Roman wine amphora fragment in the excavated remains of a 1st century taberna along Watling Street near modern Verulamium represents more than mere archaeological curiosity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. This clay shard, marked with the distinctive stamp of a Gaulish wine merchant and discovered alongside bronze coins bearing the image of Emperor Claudius, provides tangible evidence of the commercial drinking establishments that accompanied Roman military expansion into Britain during the 1st century of the Common Era. The taberna, a Latin term describing a single-room shop or stall that could serve multiple commercial functions, including the retail sale of wine and other beverages, represented the earliest systematic approach to public drinking spaces in the British Isles, introducing architectural forms, commercial practices, and social customs that would influence the development of English drinking culture for nearly 2 millennia. The Roman conquest, initiated in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius, brought not merely military occupation, but a comprehensive transformation of the urban landscape in the territories that would eventually become England, establishing planned settlements with standardized commercial districts, where tabernae occupied prominent positions along the major thoroughfares, connecting military installations with civilian population centers. The archaeological record from Roman Britain reveals the systematic presence of drinking establishments in virtually every significant settlement, from the provincial capital at Londinium through major urban centers like Eboracum, Lindum, suggesting that public drinking spaces formed an essential component of Roman commercial and social infrastructure, rather than representing peripheral or marginal activities within the urban economy. The physical remains of Roman-era drinking establishments, excavated at sites throughout southern and central Britain, demonstrate architectural characteristics that would establish enduring patterns for commercial drinking spaces, including ground-floor locations with direct street access, relatively compact interior dimensions designed to accommodate standing customers, engaged in brief transactions, and minimal provisions for extended social gatherings or residential accommodation. The tabernae at Verulamium, reconstructed from foundation evidence and comparative analysis with better preserved continental examples, typically measured approximately 15 to 20 feet in width and 25 to 30 feet in depth, creating commercial spaces that could accommodate perhaps a dozen customers simultaneously, while maintaining the rapid customer turnover essential for profitable retail operations in high-traffic urban locations. The beverages available in Romano-British tabernae reflected the drinking preferences and supply networks of Mediterranean civilization, with wine imported from Gaul and the Italian peninsula occupying the most prestigious position in the hierarchy of available drinks, followed by cervesia, the Latin term for the indigenous Celtic beer produced through the fermentation of barley or wheat, which continued to be consumed primarily by lower status customers and military personnel stationed far from reliable wine supply routes. The social composition of taberna clientele reflected the hierarchical nature of Roman society, while simultaneously creating spaces where individuals from different social strata might interact in ways that would be impossible in more rigidly structured settings such as religious ceremonies or official administrative proceedings. With archaeological evidence and comparative analysis of continental sources suggesting that Roman drinking establishments in Britain served military personnel from nearby garrisons, merchants and craftsmen conducting business in urban commercial districts, travelers requiring refreshment during journeys along the Roman road network, and members of the urban working population seeking respite from their labor in workshops, construction sites, and domestic service positions. The hours of operation for Romano-British tabernae likely followed patterns documented elsewhere in the Roman Empire, with establishments opening in the morning to serve customers seeking breakfast refreshment and continuing operations through the afternoon and evening until local curfew regulations or the natural rhythms of urban life reduced customer traffic to levels that no longer justified remaining open. The relationship between drinking establishments and other commercial activities in Romano-British towns created integrated retail districts where tabernae operated alongside food vendors, bakeries, butcher shops, and various craft workshops, enabling customers to combine beverage purchases with other shopping activities and creating commercial synergies that benefited all the businesses operating in close proximity. The presence of gaming pieces, including dice made from bone or ivory and counters used in various board games, in the archaeological deposits associated with Romano-British drinking establishments, suggests that gambling and gaming activities formed part of the social experience of taberna patronage, providing entertainment that encouraged customers to linger and purchase additional drinks while creating opportunities for the establishment operators to profit from facilitating gaming activities through the provision of equipment or the collection of fees from participants. The food offerings available in Roman drinking establishments remain somewhat obscure in the archaeological record from Britain, but comparative evidence from better documented continental sites suggests that many tabernae offered simple prepared foods, including bread, cheese, olives, and various preserved or cooked items that could be quickly served to customers seeking sustenance alongside their beverages, creating a commercial model that combined drink retail with basic food service in ways that would characterize English public drinking establishments throughout their subsequent development. The introduction of Roman drinking culture to Britain created encounters between Mediterranean social customs and indigenous Celtic traditions, producing hybrid practices that adapted Roman commercial forms to local preferences and conditions, while simultaneously introducing British populations to new beverages, social rituals, and architectural arrangements that would persist in modified forms long after the collapse of Roman political authority. The gradual re-emergence of commercial drinking establishments in Anglo-Saxon England developed alongside the broader processes of economic recovery and urban revival that characterized the 7th through 9th centuries, with the archaeological and documentary evidence indicating that specialized venues for public drinking began appearing in market settlements and emergent urban centers as monetary exchange systems, long-distance trade networks, and craft specialization created the economic conditions necessary for supporting retail beverage sales. The establishment of productive market settlements, known as wicks, during the 7th and 8th centuries, at locations including Londonwick, Eoforwick, and Hamwick, created concentrated populations of merchants, craftsmen, and labourers whose settlement patterns and occupational activities generated demand for commercial services, including beverage, retail, leading to the development of drinking establishments that served the working populations of these proto-urban centres. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity during the 7th century brought continental religious influences that included monastic traditions of beer production, with monasteries emerging as important centres for brewing activities that produced beverages for internal consumption by monastic communities, while also generating surplus production that could be sold to support monastic finances, creating an ecclesiastical brewing sector that would remain significant in English beer production for nearly a millennium. The documentary evidence from the 8th and 9th centuries begins providing explicit references to drinking establishments using vernacular, Old English terms, including alehouses, literally meaning alehouse, suggesting the development of a distinctive English vocabulary for commercial drinking spaces that reflected their primary function as retail venues for ale, the unhopped fermented beverage produced from malted barley that would remain the dominant drink in English public houses until the widespread adoption of hopped beer during the 15th and 16th centuries. The emergence of royal and aristocratic control over urban markets during the 9th and 10th centuries brought increased regulation of commercial activities, including beverage, retail, with legal codes from this period establishing requirements for witnesses to transactions, prohibitions against trading on Sundays and Christian holy days, and provisions for the collection of tolls and fees from merchants operating in regulated market spaces, creating a framework for official supervision of drinking establishments that would intensify during subsequent centuries. The Scandinavian settlements in northern and eastern England during the late 9th and 10th centuries, following the Viking invasions and the establishment of the Danelaw, introduced additional cultural influences on drinking customs and commercial practices, with Norse traditions emphasizing communal drinking in elite halls, while also bringing commercial networks that connected English markets to Scandinavian trade routes, extending across the North Sea and into the Baltic region, potentially expanding the range of beverages available in English drinking establishments through the import of mead and other products from Northern Europe. The emergence of taverns as distinct from alehouses during the 13th and 14th centuries reflected the growing sophistication of English urban drinking culture and the increasing importation of wine from continental sources, with taverns specializing in wine sales and typically occupying more substantial commercial premises than the household-based alehouses that served the urban working population. The distinction between alehouses and taverns involved not merely the beverages sold, but also the social status of typical clientele, the architectural character of the establishments, and the regulatory frameworks governing their operations, with taverns serving wealthier customers, including merchants, professionals, and members of the gentry who could afford imported wine and who expected more comfortable accommodations than those available in working-class alehouses. The tavern architecture documented in urban property records and surviving buildings from the later medieval period reveals more substantial commercial structures that often featured multiple rooms including specialized drinking areas, separate from service spaces, upper floors providing accommodation for the tavern keeper's family, or rental lodgings for customers, and cellars designed for wine storage that maintained the cool temperatures necessary for preserving imported wines through England's warmer months. The higher capital requirements for establishing taverns, reflecting both the need for more substantial premises and the costs of purchasing wine from importers who maintained their own distribution networks, meant that tavern keeping attracted more substantial entrepreneurs than the predominantly female household brewers who operated neighborhood alehouses, creating a gender division in the structure of medieval drinking establishments that would persist in modified forms through subsequent centuries. The regulation of wine taverns proceeded through different mechanisms than alehouse supervision, with wine trade falling under royal jurisdiction through customs arrangements and monopoly grants that attempted to control wine imports and extract revenue from this lucrative trade, while urban authorities issued tavern licenses that conveyed the right to retail wine within specific jurisdictions and collected fees from licensed tavern keepers that contributed to municipal finances. The social functions of medieval taverns included providing venues for business transactions among merchants who required neutral meeting spaces for contract negotiations and commercial dealings, offering accommodations for travelers who needed lodging while conducting business in urban centers, and creating semi-public spaces where members of urban elites could socialize outside their private residences without mingling with the lower status populations who frequented working-class alehouses. The geographical concentration of taverns in major port cities and commercial centers reflected the wine trade's dependence on maritime imports and the concentration of wealthy consumers in locations with substantial merchant populations, leading to clusters of wine taverns in London, Bristol, Southampton, and other significant trading ports where wine arriving from Gascony and other continental sources could be readily distributed to retail establishments. The development of inns as a third category of public drinking establishment emerged during the 14th and 15th centuries in response to the expanding needs of overland travelers who required not merely refreshment, but also overnight accommodation and stabling for horses, with inns combining beverage service with lodging facilities and becoming particularly important along major roads, connecting London with regional centres and at significant market towns where travellers converged for commerce and ascend administration. The architectural elaboration of medieval inns exceeded that of both alehouses and taverns, requiring substantial courtyard plans that provided secure enclosures for valuable horses and goods, while offering multiple rooms for different categories of customers, with the most developed inns featuring galleries overlooking interior courtyards, specialized chambers for wealthy travelers seeking private accommodations, common sleeping halls for lower status guests, stables and storage buildings, and ground floor public rooms where travelers and local residents could purchase food and drink. The economic model of inn operations depended on combining multiple revenue streams, including charges for lodging, fees for stabling and fodder, sales of food and beverages, and various ancillary services provided to travelers, creating more complex business enterprises than simple alehouses or taverns, and requiring innkeepers to possess substantial capital resources and management capabilities. The social significance of inns extended beyond their immediate commercial functions to encompass roles as information nodes, where news from distant locations circulated through conversations among travelers from different regions, as venues for official business, where royal officials, judges, and administrative officers conducted government activities while traveling on circuit through the provinces, and as markers of community status, with the presence of substantial inns indicating a settlement's importance in regional, commercial, and administrative networks. The regulation of inns reflected their hybrid nature as commercial establishments providing both retail beverage service and accommodation, with licenses typically granted by local justices of the peace, who assess the applicant's character and the community need for additional lodging facilities, while separate regulations governed specific aspects of inn operations, including maximum charges for accommodations, requirements for maintaining adequate supplies of food and drink, and obligations to provide lodging to travelers unless legitimate reasons justified refusal. The personnel requirements of successful inn operations exceeded those of simpler drinking establishments, with larger inns employing ostlers to care for horses, kitchen staff to prepare meals, chambermaids to maintain sleeping accommodations, and servers to attend customers in the public drinking rooms, creating employment opportunities that made substantial inns significant. Local employers whose fortunes affected broader community economic conditions. The social geography of medieval drinking establishments reflected and reinforced the hierarchical organization of English society, while simultaneously creating spaces where social boundaries might become temporarily blurred through the paunsbeit, anonymity and informality of public drinking contexts, with different types of establishments serving distinct clienteles, while occasionally bringing together individuals from different social strata who would rarely interact in other contexts. The proliferation of alehouses in both urban and rural settings during the 14th century proceeded alongside population growth and economic expansion during the first half of the century, before the catastrophic impact of the Black Death in 1348 and 1349 drastically reduced England's population and disrupted established economic and social patterns. The demographic collapse, caused by plague, reduced the customer base for drinking establishments, while simultaneously creating labor shortages that increased wages for surviving workers, potentially expanding the disposable income available to working people for discretionary purchases, including ale consumption, creating complex and sometimes contradictory effects on the drinking establishment sector. The social changes following the Black Death included increased geographic mobility, as surviving peasants sought better economic opportunities, greater social fluidity, as traditional hierarchical relationships weakened in the face of labor shortages, and intensified concerns among ruling elites about maintaining social order and controlling the behavior of lower status populations, whose increased economic leverage threatened established authority structures, all of which affected the development and regulation of public drinking establishments. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while primarily concerned with taxation and labor legislation, demonstrated the potential for alehouses and taverns to serve as gathering places where political discontent could be discussed and organized, resistance planned, reinforcing elite anxieties about drinking establishments as potential threats to social order, and contributing to increasingly restrictive regulatory approaches that sought to limit the number of alehouses and enhance official supervision of their operations. The proliferation of licensing requirements during the late 14th and 15th centuries reflected both the desire to control potentially disorderly establishments and the recognition that license fees could generate revenue for cessis, royal and local governments, creating a regulatory system that treated drinking establishments as privileges granted by authorities, rather than as simple commercial enterprises that could be freely established by anyone with the necessary resources, inclination. The introduction of hopped beer to England during the 15th century initiated a gradual transformation in English drinking culture that would eventually displace traditional ale as the dominant beverage, while creating new categories of brewing specialists and beverage retailers who dealt in the imported product and its domestic imitations. The term beer entered English vocabulary from Dutch or Low German sources during this period, initially designating the hopped beverage imported from the Low Countries and subsequently applied to English-produced imitations that incorporated hops into traditional brewing processes, creating a terminological distinction between ale for the traditional English unhopped beverage and beer for the hopped product that would persist in commercial usage even after hops became standard ingredients in most English brewing. The gradual acceptance of hopped beer proceeded unevenly across different regions and social classes, with initial resistance reflecting both taste preferences for traditional ale and xenophobic suspicion of foreign products, before the practical advantages of hopped beer, particularly its superior keeping qualities and reduced susceptibility to spoilage, convinced increasing numbers of consumers to accept the new beverage despite its different flavor profile. The establishment of beer breweries operated by immigrant Dutch and German brewers in London and other ports during the late 15th and early 16th centuries created specialized production facilities that differed from traditional ale brewing in their larger scale, more systematic production methods, and capital-intensive equipment designed for producing hopped beer in commercial quantities for retail distribution through alehouses and taverns. The brewing industry's gradual evolution toward hopped beer production proceeded alongside the development of commercial brewing as a specialized occupation separated from household production, with larger brewing operations emerging that produced beverages for wholesale distribution rather than for direct retail sales, creating a distinction between brewers who focused on production and alehouse keepers who specialized in retail activities, though many establishments continued combining both functions throughout this transitional period. The impact of beer adoption on drinking establishments included changes in storage and service practices that accommodated beer's longer shelf life, modifications in pricing structures that reflected the different costs of ale and beer production, and the gradual transformation of customer expectations regarding beverage characteristics as hopped beer became increasingly familiar and eventually preferred over traditional ale. The physical characteristics of Tudor drinking establishments evolved gradually toward the forms that would become standard during subsequent centuries, with purpose-built alehouses and taverns becoming more common as beverage retail developed into a specialized commercial activity rather than a supplementary household enterprise, though many establishments continued operating from adapted domestic buildings that combined residential and commercial functions under the same roof. The introduction of inn signs during this period provided permanent visual markers that identified drinking establishments for literate and illiterate customers alike, with painted wooden boards suspended from projecting brackets displaying pictorial symbols that became the establishment's recognized identity within the community, and that increasingly acquired proper names referring to the images depicted, creating the naming conventions that would characterize English pubs throughout their subsequent history. The elaboration of inn sign imagery reflected both practical concerns about creating memorable and easily recognized symbols and the cultural references that resonated with contemporary audiences, including royal symbols such as crowns and roses, heraldic devices borrowed from aristocratic patrons or prominent local families, religious imagery surviving from pre-Reformation traditions. Despite Protestant iconoclasm, occupational symbols referencing local industries or trades, and various animals, objects, and scenes that created distinctive identities for individual establishments. The internal arrangements of Tudor alehouses and taverns began incorporating specialized furniture, including fixed benches and tables, rather than relying on movable pieces that might serve multiple household functions, creating more permanent commercial spaces configured specifically for the accommodation of drinking customers, rather than adapted from general-purpose domestic rooms. The development of multiple rooms within larger establishments enabled social segregation of customers, according to status, with separate spaces designated for different classes of patrons who could thus socialize with their peers without uncomfortable proximity to social superiors or inferiors, creating architectural expressions of social hierarchy within the physical structure of drinking establishments. The provision of gaming equipment, including boards for various table games, cards, dice, and later bowls and similar lawn games played in outdoor spaces adjacent to establishments represented expanding entertainment offerings designed to attract customers and encourage extended visits that would increase beverage consumption and generate additional revenue for the establishment operators. The growing importance of tobacco consumption during the late 16th century, following its introduction from the Americas, created new social practices associated with public drinking, with tobacco smoking becoming a common accompaniment to ale or beer consumption, and with some establishments developing reputations as particular venues for tobacco enthusiasts who gathered to smoke and discuss the merits of different tobacco varieties and smoking practices. The expansion of London during the Tudor period brought concentrations of drinking establishments that far exceeded those found in provincial towns, with estimates suggesting that late 16th century London contained over 1,000 licensed alehouses, taverns, and inns, serving a population that had grown to perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, creating densities of drinking establishments that reflected both the capital's role as a commercial and administrative centre, attracting transient populations, requiring refreshment and accommodation, and the concentration of wage, labourers and craftsmen, whose living arrangements lacked facilities for food and drink preparation, making them dependent on commercial sources for sustenance. The geographical distribution of London drinking establishments reflected both the dispersed character of the early modern city, with its multiple commercial and residential districts, and the concentration of particular types of establishments in specific locations, including clusters of taverns near commercial centres where merchants conducted business, concentrations of inns along major roads entering the city, where travellers required accommodations, and alehouses scattered throughout residential neighbourhoods, serving local communities with their daily beverage needs. The social functions of London drinking establishments exceeded those of provincial counterparts due to the capital's role as a centre for politics, commerce, culture, and administration, with specific taverns developing reputations as gathering places for particular occupational groups, political factions, or cultural circles, creating semi-public spaces where business could be conducted, information exchanged, and social networks maintained outside the formal institutional settings of guilds, courts, and governmental offices. The theatrical district on the south bank of the Thames developed particularly dense concentrations of drinking establishments, serving audiences attending performances at the Globe, Rose, and other playhouses, with these establishments benefiting from entertainment-related traffic while contributing to the area's reputation as a venue for popular recreation that mixed cultural sophistication with earthier pleasures including drinking, gambling, and prostitution. The Mermaid Tavern on Bread Street achieved fame during the early 17th century as the meeting place for a literary club that included Ben Jonson, John Donne, and other prominent writers, exemplifying how particular establishments could become identified with specific cultural circles, while also serving more ordinary customers, whose patronage provided the financial foundation for the business operations. The diversity of London drinking establishments reflected the capital's cosmopolitan character, with establishments serving specific ethnic and national communities, including Dutch, French, and Italian immigrants who sought familiar beverages and social environments, creating cultural enclaves within the broader landscape of London drinking culture. The social concerns about drinking establishments that intensified during the late Tudor and early Stuart periods reflected broader anxieties about social order and moral behaviour that characterised English Protestantism, with Puritan critics particularly vocal in their condemnation of alehouses as venues for idleness, drunkenness, sexual immorality, and other sins that diverted people from productive labour and godly living. The pamphlet literature of the late 16th and early 17th centuries included numerous attacks on alehouses and their patrons, depicting these establishments as sources of social disorder, where the labouring poor wasted money needed for family support, where conspiracy and sedition found fertile ground away from the oversight of authorities, and where traditional social hierarchies broke down as customers from different ranks mingled inappropriately. The defence of drinking establishments, while less prominent in surviving literature, emphasised their economic necessity for travellers requiring accommodations their social functions as community gathering places where neighbours could maintain social bonds, and their role in providing employment for alehouse keepers and brewers, whose livelihoods depended on beverage retail. The tension between critics and defenders of drinking establishments reflected fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between individual freedom and social control, the role of pleasure and recreation in a well-ordered society, and the extent to which authorities should regulate the private behaviours of subjects, creating debates that would continue through subsequent centuries as different interest groups contested the cultural meaning and social significance of public drinking. The expansion of licensing requirements and increasingly strict enforcement during the early 17th century represented partial victories for critics who sought to reduce the number of drinking establishments and enhance their regulation, with justices in some jurisdictions refusing to renew licenses for establishments deemed excessive or disorderly, while requiring remaining license holders to post larger bonds and submit to more intrusive supervision of their business practices and the conduct of their customers. The practical effectiveness of enhanced regulation remained limited by the realities of enforcement, with local justices often lacking the resources or will to conduct systematic inspections, and with communities frequently protecting their local alehouses against what they perceived as officious interference from distant authorities, failed to understand local conditions and needs. The English Civil War period from 1642 through 1651 brought disruption to drinking establishments as to all aspects of English life, with military operations, shifting political allegiances, and economic upheaval affecting the operation and regulation of alehouses, taverns, and inns throughout the country. The movement of armies created extraordinary demand for beverages and accommodations in areas where troops were quartered or through which they marched, bringing temporary prosperity to some establishments while exposing others to confiscation, destruction, or forced provisioning that depleted their stocks without adequate compensation. The political divisions of the Civil War period affected drinking establishments, as both royalist and parliamentary factions sought to suppress alehouses they perceived as harbouring enemy sympathisers, with local authorities in areas controlled by each side scrutinising licences and closing establishments, believed to be meeting places for opponents, creating a politicisation of alehouse regulation that exceeded previous concerns about disorder and immorality. The Commonwealth period from 1649 through 1660 brought Puritan governance that intensified regulation of drinking establishments through various mechanisms, including stricter licensing requirements, enhanced penalties for drunkenness and disorder, and attempts to suppress Sunday drinking that conflicted with Sabbatarian principles, emphasizing religious observance over popular recreation. The major generals appointed to govern English regions during 1655 and 1656 pursued particularly aggressive policies against alehouses, closing numerous establishments and harassing their operators as part of broader campaigns to impose godly discipline on reluctant populations, creating resentments that contributed to the widespread welcome that greeted the restoration of Charles II in 1660. The Restoration brought relaxation of the most severe restrictions on drinking establishments, with Charles II's government recognizing that popular support depended partly on distancing itself from Commonwealth austerity and permitting the recreational activities that Puritan governance had attempted to suppress, though the regulatory frameworks established during earlier periods remained in place, with modifications that reflected the restored monarchy's concerns about maintaining order, while avoiding the appearance of puritanical interference with popular pleasures. The late 17th century brought significant changes to the structure of England's brewing industry that would profoundly affect drinking establishments, including the emergence of larger commercial breweries operating at scales that dwarfed traditional alehouse brewing, the development of wholesale distribution networks that separated beer production from retail sales, and the beginnings of financial relationships between brewers and alehouse keepers that would eventually produce the tied house system dominating 20th century pub operations. The growth of London porter production during the early 18th century represented the most dramatic manifestation of brewing industry consolidation, with substantial breweries utilizing improved production techniques and economies of scale to produce dark beer in unprecedented quantities for distribution through hundreds of retail outlets, creating the first industrialized beverage production and distribution system in English history. The technological innovations in brewing during this period included improved understanding of temperature control, the development of more efficient malt kilns, innovations in barrel construction and cooperage that reduced waste and improved storage, and gradually accumulating empirical knowledge about fermentation processes that enabled more consistent product quality, even before scientific understanding of yeast biology emerged during the 19th century. The separation of brewing from retail operations proceeded unevenly across different regions and establishment types, with rural alehouses often continuing to brew their own beverages, while urban establishments increasingly purchased beer from wholesale brewers who could offer consistent products at competitive prices, creating a bifurcated structure where traditional practices coexisted with emerging industrial methods. The financial arrangements between brewers and retailers evolved during the late 17th and 18th centuries, from simple wholesale transactions toward more complex relationships, including loans from brewers to alehouse keepers, exclusive supply agreements that bound retailers to purchase from specific brewers, and eventually brewery ownership of retail premises that created the tied house system, where publicans operated properties owned by brewing companies and sold only their products. The development of these financial relationships reflected brewers' efforts to secure stable markets for their products and retailers' needs for capital to establish or maintain their businesses, creating interdependencies that would fundamentally shape the organization of the English pub industry through the 19th and 20th centuries. The gin craze of the early 18th century brought a new category of drinking establishments and raised social concerns about public drinking to unprecedented levels, with the widespread consumption of cheap distilled spirits in urban areas, creating health and social problems that prompted governmental intervention and contributed to evolving attitudes about alcohol consumption and its regulation. The removal of restrictions on distilling during the late 17th century, combined with agricultural surpluses that depressed grain prices, made spirit production economically attractive, leading to proliferation of small-scale distilling operations and the emergence of gin shops that sold spirits for on-premises consumption in basic surroundings that lacked even the minimal amenities of traditional alehouses. The social impact of readily available cheap gin fell most heavily on London's urban poor, who could obtain rapid intoxication at costs substantially below those required for equivalent effects from beer consumption, leading to public drunkenness, family neglect, infant mortality, and various social pathologies that contemporary observers documented with horror in written accounts and visual imagery, including William Hogarth's famous Gin Lane print of 1751. The campaign against gin consumption during the 1730s and 1740s mobilized religious leaders, social reformers, and governmental authorities who implemented increasingly stringent regulations, including licensing requirements for spirit retailers, excise taxes designed to increase prices, and penalties for illegal sales, culminating in the Gin Act of 1751 that effectively ended the most destructive phase of the gin craze through a combination of regulation and taxation that made spirits less accessible while channeling their sale through more respectable outlets. The gin craze and its resolution established precedents for addressing concerns about excessive alcohol consumption through a combination of taxation, licensing, and regulation, rather than absolute prohibition, creating policy approaches that would characterize English alcohol control measures through subsequent centuries, despite periodic temperance movements calling for more radical interventions. The impact on traditional drinking establishments included enhanced distinctions between respectable alehouses and taverns that sold beer and wine in orderly environments versus disreputable gin shops associated with the most destructive forms of alcohol abuse, contributing to evolving hierarchies of drinking venues that correlated beverage types with different levels of social acceptability and different classes of customers. The emergence of the public house or pub as a distinctive category of drinking establishment during the 18th century reflected the consolidation of earlier alehouse, tavern, and inn traditions into a relatively standardized form that combined beverage retail with various social functions while operating under increasingly systematic regulatory frameworks that treated these establishments as quasi-public. Institutions subject to official oversight in exchange for licenses granting commercial privileges. The terminology public house appeared with increasing frequency during the 18th century, gradually displacing older terms, including alehouse and tavern, while suggesting that these establishments served public functions that justified their regulation and that distinguished them from private drinking that occurred in domestic settings without official supervision or restriction. The architectural evolution of 18th century public houses brought increasing standardization of building forms that reflected their specialized commercial functions, including ground-floor public rooms designed for customer accommodation, service bars separating customers from beverage storage areas, distinct spaces for different classes of customers, maintaining social hierarchies within the establishment, and residential quarters for the publican's family typically located on upper floors above the commercial spaces. The exterior presentation of public houses developed distinctive characteristics, including prominent signage, identifying the establishment, large windows, providing visibility from the street, and illumination for interior spaces, and architectural details that distinguish these commercial premises from neighboring residential buildings, while projecting images of prosperity and respectability designed to attract customers and satisfy regulatory expectations. The internal organization of pub spaces reflected evolving social practices and commercial requirements, with the development of the bar counter as a specialized feature separating customers from service areas, the creation of distinct rooms or areas designated for different purposes, including general drinking spaces, private rooms for meetings or parties, and tap rooms serving working-class customers seeking basic refreshment without the amenities provided in more elaborate public areas. The provision of seating, tables, heating, and illumination improved substantially during the 18th century, as public houses competed for customers by offering more comfortable environments than had characterized earlier alehouses, creating expectations that drinking establishments would provide not merely beverages, but also pleasant surroundings, where customers could spend extended periods in relative comfort. The social functions of 18th century public houses expanded beyond simple beverage retail to encompass a wide range of community activities that made these establishments central institutions in both urban and rural social life, including serving as venues for voluntary association meetings, where benefit societies, trade clubs, and various social organizations gathered regularly, providing spaces for popular entertainment including singing, musical performances, and various games and competitions, functioning as informal labor exchanges where employers seeking workers and workers seeking employment could make connections, and offering venues for commercial transactions and business dealings that required neutral meeting spaces outside parties' own premises. The development of pub games during this period, including skittles, darts, cards, dominoes, and various other activities, provided entertainment that encouraged customers to linger and purchase additional beverages while creating the social interactions and regular gatherings that built community bonds among participants. The reading of newspapers in public houses became increasingly common during the 18th century as literacy expanded and newspaper production increased, with some establishments subscribing to papers that attracted customers interested in news and current affairs, creating spaces where political information circulated and where public opinion formed through discussions among patrons debating the issues of the day. The role of public houses as venues for political meetings and discussions made them important sites for the development of popular politics during the 18th century, with radical reformers utilizing pub-back rooms for meetings that authorities sometimes sought to suppress, while more established political interests, including both Whigs and Tories, maintained connections with specific public houses that served as bases for electoral organizing and political networking. The commercial functions of public houses extended to providing venues for auctions, inquests, petty sessions where local justices heard minor cases, and various other official and semi-official activities that required spaces capable of accommodating groups of people in relatively formal settings. demonstrating the extent to which these ostensibly private commercial establishments served public functions that blurred the boundaries between commercial and governmental spheres. The development of coaching inns during the 18th century brought a specialized category of establishments serving the expanding needs of overland travelers, as improved roads and more regular coach services increased the volume and predictability of long-distance travel, creating opportunities for substantial inns positioned along major routes, connecting London with provincial centres and providing the full range of services required by travellers and the coaching industry. The architectural elaboration of coaching inns reflected their complex operational requirements, including large courtyards capable of accommodating multiple coaches with their teams of horses, extensive stabling facilities for the dozens or hundreds of horses required for coach operations, accommodation ranging from private chambers for wealthy travellers to common sleeping halls for less affluent passengers, public rooms serving both travellers and local residents who patronised the inn for its social amenities, and service facilities including kitchens, brewhouses, storage areas, and workshops supporting the establishment's diverse activities. The economic model of coaching inns depended on multiple revenue streams, including fees for lodging, calculated according to accommodation quality, charges for meals and beverages consumed by travellers and local customers, income from stabling and fodder for horses, payments from coach operators for using the inn as a staging point, and various incidental charges for services provided to travellers, creating substantial businesses that might employ dozens of workers in their various departments, and that represented significant capital investments, justifiable only in locations with sufficient traffic to ensure adequate utilization. The social significance of coaching inns exceeded their immediate commercial functions, with the largest and most successful establishments serving as landmarks in their communities, as sources of employment for substantial numbers of local workers, as gathering places where local elites mingled with travelers bringing news and perspectives from distant locations, and as symbols of their community's connections to broader regional and national networks of communication and commerce. The decline of coaching inns during the railway age of the mid-19th century brought economic disaster to many establishments that had prospered from coach traffic, with the rapid expansion of rail networks causing the abandonment of many coaching routes and the transformation of inns from essential transportation infrastructure to local public houses serving only neighbourhood customers, creating patterns of decline and adaptation that would recur during the 20th century as transportation technologies continued to evolve. The reform movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought renewed attention to drinking establishments as targets for moral improvement campaigns, with evangelical Christians, political radicals seeking to improve working-class conditions, and various social reformers identifying public houses as obstacles to the elevation of the labouring population and proposing various measures to reduce their influence or counteract their alleged deleterious effects. The temperance movement emerging during the 1820s initially advocated moderation in alcohol consumption rather than absolute abstinence, promoting beer and wine drinking as alternatives to spirits, while seeking to reduce excessive consumption through moral suasion and the provision of alternative recreational opportunities. Though the movement would later evolve toward calls for complete prohibition that would characterize late 19th and early 20th century temperance activism. The development of coffee houses and temperance hotels during the 19th century represented attempts to provide alternatives to traditional public houses, offering non-alcoholic beverages and respectable social environments designed to attract working-class customers seeking refreshment without the alcohol consumption and potentially disorderly atmosphere associated with pubs. Though these alternatives achieved only limited success in displacing traditional drinking establishments in most communities, the political radicalism of the early 19th century maintained complex relationships with public houses, with radical reformers utilizing these establishments as meeting spaces and organizing centers, while simultaneously critiquing the role of alcohol in pacifying working-class discontent and diverting energy that might otherwise be directed toward political change, creating tensions within working-class movements between those who viewed pubs as essential community institutions and those who saw them as tools of oppression that required reform or elimination. The Beer Act of 1830 reflected political calculations about the role of drinking establishments in English society, with the government seeking to encourage beer consumption at the expense of spirits by dramatically liberalizing licensing requirements for beer houses, allowing any ratepayer to obtain a license to sell beer without the approval of local magistrates, creating thousands of new drinking establishments that proponents hoped would provide alternatives to gin palaces and spirit shops associated with the most destructive forms of alcohol abuse. The consequences of the Beer Act demonstrated the complexity of alcohol regulation, with the proliferation of beer houses creating competitive pressures on established public houses, while generating concerns about the quality and oversight of the new establishments, many of which operated in makeshift premises with minimal amenities, and which became associated in the public mind with disorder and low-class drinking that reformers had hoped to eliminate. The campaign to repeal or modify the Beer Act brought together strange bedfellows, including temperance advocates who opposed any expansion of drinking opportunities, established publicans who resented the new competition, and local authorities who objected to the loss of licensing control, eventually leading to reforms that restored some degree of official oversight while preserving the lower barriers to entry that had enabled the beer house proliferation. The mid-Victorian period brought the apogee of the gin palace, elaborate urban drinking establishments designed to attract customers through spectacular architectural displays that transformed beverage retail into theatrical experiences, with establishments featuring gaslighting creating brilliant illumination, large plate glass windows providing visibility from the street, ornate fixtures and fittings, including elaborate bars and decorative elements, and impressive facades that announced these buildings as temples of commercial entertainment rather than simple neighborhood drinking establishments. The gin palace phenomenon reflected both the commercial strategies of spirit retailers seeking to differentiate their establishments in competitive urban markets and the cultural dynamics of industrial society where workers sought escapism and entertainment in their limited leisure time, making drinking establishments that offered spectacular environments attractive destinations for spending wages earned through repetitive industrial labor. The social criticism directed at gin palaces emphasized their role in encouraging excessive consumption through their seductive atmospheres, their association with urban working-class populations whose drinking behaviors middle-class observers found threatening, and their apparent contradiction of Victorian values emphasizing respectability, self-discipline, and domestic virtue, contributing to ongoing debates about the proper place of public drinking in industrial society. The rise of the brewing industry to industrial scale during the 19th century profoundly transformed the organization of English public houses through the expansion of the tied house system, where brewing companies acquired ownership or control of retail outlets, creating vertical integration that ensured markets for brewery production, while limiting publicans' independence and altering the competitive dynamics of the pub sector. The consolidation of brewing into larger firms proceeded through several mechanisms, including the organic growth of successful regional brewers who expanded production capacity and acquired retail outlets, the purchase of smaller brewers and their tied estates by larger companies seeking to increase market share, and the formation of new brewing companies through mergers and public stock offerings that raised capital for expansion and rationalization. The financial advantages of the tied house system for brewers included secured distribution channels, eliminating the need to compete for retail accounts, guaranteed income from property rents in addition to beer sales, and increased asset values as pub properties could be mortgaged to finance further expansion, creating self-reinforcing growth patterns that enabled the largest brewers to dominate regional markets, while making independent operation increasingly difficult for both small brewers and free-house publicans. The implications for publicans included reduced autonomy, as brewery owners imposed requirements regarding operating procedures, opening hours, product selection, and facility maintenance, while providing benefits including secured tenancies that reduced business risks, access to capital improvements funded by brewery owners, and support from brewing company field staff who provided advice on operations and assisted with regulatory compliance. The geographical concentration of tied houses reflected the regional organization of the brewing industry, with major brewers dominating specific territories through their control of numerous retail outlets, creating informal divisions of the English pub market among the largest brewing companies, whose competitive strategies focused increasingly on acquiring additional tied houses, rather than competing on product quality or price in free markets. The architectural consequences of brewery ownership included substantial investments in pub building and renovation, as brewing companies sought to create distinctive branded establishments that projected images of respectability, quality, while accommodating growing customer expectations regarding comfort and amenities, contributing to the development of the substantial Victorian pubs, whose architecture remains prominent in many English urban landscapes. The Victorian pub emerged as a distinctive architectural and social form that synthesized earlier traditions while responding to the specific conditions of industrial urban society, creating establishments that ranged from basic working-class beer houses serving neighborhood populations to elaborate urban showpieces featuring multiple rooms, ornate decoration, and sophisticated service systems, reflecting substantial capital investment by brewery owners seeking to maximize returns from prime commercial locations. The typical Victorian pub layout featured multiple distinct spaces, segregated by class and gender, including public bars serving working-class customers with minimal amenities and lower prices, saloon bars offering more comfortable surroundings and slightly higher prices for lower middle-class customers, private bars providing intimate spaces for small groups seeking more genteel surroundings, snugs or private compartments offering discreet drinking opportunities for customers concerned about reputation, and sometimes ladies' bars or family rooms attempting to attract female customers and families in contexts where women's pub attendance remained controversial. The development of specialized bar fittings during the Victorian period created the elaborate servery arrangements that characterized traditional English pubs, including complex bar counters, with multiple serving positions allowing staff to attend customers in different rooms simultaneously, elaborate back bar fixtures displaying bottles and providing storage while creating impressive visual displays, etched and decorated glass screens separating spaces while maintaining sight lines, and various technical improvements, including beer engines, enabling servers to draw beer from basement cellars, sophisticated cooling systems, maintaining product quality, and gas or later electric lighting, creating the well-illuminated interiors that distinguished Victorian pubs from earlier establishments dependent on natural light or primitive artificial illumination. The decoration of Victorian pubs incorporated diverse stylistic influences, including Gothic revival elements, suggesting historical continuity, classical details implying respectability and permanence, arts and crafts design emphasizing craftsmanship and natural materials, and sometimes exotic or orientalist motifs, creating escapist fantasies, reflecting the period's aesthetic pluralism and the desire to create memorable environments that would attract and retain customers in competitive urban markets. The provision of entertainment in Victorian pubs expanded substantially beyond traditional pub games to include sing-songs and music hall performances in establishments with sufficient space and customer base to support such dienchtas activities, creating venues where popular entertainment developed and where working-class cultural expression found outlets, though also generating concerns about disorder and immorality that prompted regulatory attention to music and dancing licenses. The temperance movement reached its peak influence during the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, achieving significant restrictions on public house operations, while stopping short of the prohibition that temperance advocates increasingly demanded, with campaigns emphasizing the social costs of excessive drinking, including family poverty, industrial accidents, child neglect, and public disorder, creating political pressure for governmental action to limit drinking opportunities and reduce alcohol consumption. The political power of temperance organizations derived from their ability to mobilize middle-class voters concerned about social reform, their connections with nonconformist religious denominations that formed important constituencies in many regions, and their success in framing public drinking as a social problem requiring governmental intervention rather than a private matter of individual choice, creating coalitions that influenced licensing policy despite opposition from the brewing industry, publicans, and much of the working-class population whose drinking practices reformers sought to restrict. The licensing reforms enacted during this period included measures reducing the number of licensed premises in urban areas, where reformers argued that excessive numbers of pubs encouraged drinking, restricting Sunday opening hours to limit opportunities for weekend drinking that allegedly contributed to Monday absenteeism, prohibiting certain categories of entertainment in pubs to prevent these establishments from becoming venues for immoral behavior, and increasing penalties for violations of licensing conditions, including serving intoxicated customers or permitting disorderly conduct, creating a regulatory environment substantially more restrictive than earlier periods, while still preserving the essential institution of the pub against prohibitionist demands. World War I on English pubs proved profound and lasting, with wartime concerns about industrial productivity and military efficiency prompting unprecedented governmental interventions in licensing that drastically restricted pub operations, while nationalizing the brewing industry in some regions, establishing precedents for governmental control that would influence licensing policy through the remainder of the 20th century. The Defense of the Realm Act, passed shortly after the war's outbreak in August 1914, granted the government emergency powers, including the authority to restrict alcohol sales in areas deemed strategically important, leading to dramatic reductions in opening hours, prohibitions on treating or purchasing drinks for other customers, restrictions on alcohol strength, and eventually the nationalization of breweries and pubs in areas including Carlisle and Gretna, where munitions production made worker sobriety a priority for the war effort. The reduction in opening hours implemented during 1915 cut permitted drinking times from the typical pre-war schedule of approximately 18 hours daily to approximately 5.5 hours split between midday and evening periods, eliminating morning and late evening drinking opportunities that had been standard features of pub operations since time immemorial, creating dramatic changes in working-class drinking patterns and pub business models that had assumed customers could visit establishments at virtually any hour. The prohibition on treating aimed to reduce pressure on individuals to participate in rounds and to limit overall consumption by preventing the escalation of drinking that occurred when participants felt obligated to reciprocate drinks purchased by others. Though this restriction proved unpopular and difficult to enforce, as it contradicted deeply rooted social customs that treated mutual drink buying as expressions of friendship and solidarity. The restrictions on alcohol strength, implemented through requirements that beer be diluted or brewed to lower original gravities, aimed to reduce intoxication among industrial and military workers, while preserving some beverage availability, creating weaker beers that became standard during the war years and that remained common in the immediate post-war period, before gradual strengthening restored pre-war alcohol levels in most products. The Central Control Board, established to oversee the nationalized pubs in Carlisle and other areas, experimented with reformed pub designs and operating practices, including improved food service, enhanced non-alcoholic beverage options, better facilities for women and families, and architectural improvements, creating more respectable environments, implementing paternalistic visions of reformed public houses that influenced post-war pub development, even as nationalization itself proved temporary, and most facilities returned to private ownership during the 1920s. The interwar period brought gradual relaxation of the most severe wartime restrictions while preserving many elements of the enhanced regulatory system that had emerged from wartime controls, creating a pub sector operating under substantially greater restrictions than the pre-war period, while adapting to changing social conditions, including increased automobile ownership, the expansion of suburban residential areas, shifts in working-class leisure patterns, and the gradual decline of heavy industry that had formed the economic base for many traditional pub communities. The improvement campaigns of the 1920s and 1930s promoted architectural and operational reforms designed to create more respectable establishments that would attract a broader clientele, including women and families, while reducing associations between pubs and excessive drinking or antisocial behavior, leading to the construction of suburban pubs featuring modern amenities, including large gardens, car parks, food service, and bright, spacious interiors, contrasting with the dark, compartmentalized layouts of Victorian urban pubs. The improved public house, designs promoted by brewers and licensing authorities, emphasized openness and visibility, removing the private compartments and snugs that had characterized Victorian pubs and creating open-plan layouts where customer behavior could be easily monitored, reflecting both commercial desires to maximize efficiency and regulatory concerns about preventing disorderly conduct. Though many customers mourned the loss of intimate spaces that had provided privacy and comfort in earlier pub designs. The roadhouse phenomenon emerged during the interwar period as automobile ownership enabled working and middle-class families to travel beyond their immediate neighborhoods for leisure activities, creating opportunities for pubs in rural or suburban locations along major roads to develop as destinations, offering gardens, games, food service, and other attractions beyond simple beverage service, anticipating the later development of pub dining and the transformation of pubs from neighborhood institutions into destination venues serving broader markets. The brewing industry experienced continued consolidation during the interwar period, as major brewers absorbed smaller regional competitors and expanded their tied house estates, creating the Big Six national brewers, whose dominance of the English pub market would persist through the mid-20th century, and whose business strategies focused increasingly on operational efficiency, brand development, and property management, rather than product quality or customer service innovation. The Second World War brought renewed restrictions on pub operations, though generally less severe than World War I measures, with governmental priorities focusing on maintaining civilian morale while managing scarce resources and preventing alcohol consumption from interfering with industrial production or military effectiveness, leading to limitations on opening hours, restrictions on spirit availability, as grain and other resources were diverted to essential purposes, and price controls, intended to prevent profiteering while ensuring that beer remained affordable for working populations. The social role of pubs during wartime expanded, as these establishments served as community gathering, places where civilians shared information, supported each other through hardships, and maintained social bonds under stress, with pubs becoming even more central to community life as other recreational opportunities diminished, and as the shared experience of rationing, blackout, and air raids created intense local solidarities that found expression in pub-centered social networks. The survival of pub buildings through the Blitz varied significantly by location, with establishments in heavily bombed cities, including London, Coventry, Plymouth, and other industrial centres, sometimes suffering complete destruction, while others survived with only minor damage, creating post-war reconstruction challenges for brewing companies facing decisions about whether to rebuild damaged properties or abandon sites where changing residential patterns might no longer support viable pub operations. The experience of American servicemen stationed in Britain during the war years brought cross-cultural encounters in pub settings, with American personnel encountering English drinking customs, including warm beer, limited opening hours, and reserved social interactions that contrasted sharply with American bars and taverns, while English publicans and customers adapted to the influx of foreign military personnel, whose free spending habits and more boisterous drinking styles sometimes created tensions alongside the generally positive reception accorded to Allied forces supporting the war effort. The post-war period brought gradual normalization of pub operations as wartime restrictions were lifted, but the economic and social changes wrought by the war, including the expansion of the welfare state, the restructuring of British industry, and the rise of new forms of popular entertainment, created challenges for traditional pubs, whose role in English social life began a long, slow decline that would accelerate during subsequent decades. The 1950s and early 1960s represented a period of relative stability for English pubs, operating under the licensing and operational frameworks established during the interwar period, with the pub sector recovering from wartime disruptions, while brewing companies invested in modernizing their estates through renovations that upgraded facilities, standardized operating procedures, and projected corporate identities through consistent design elements and branded furnishings. The development of keg beer during this period represented a significant technological change in beer production and distribution, with brewers adopting pasteurization and pressurized dispense systems that enabled consistent product quality, extended shelf life, and simplified cellar management compared to traditional cask-conditioned ale. though these innovations would later generate controversy as consumers and critics complained about the standardization and flavor degradation associated with keg products. The expansion of television ownership during the 1950s created new competition for pub patronage, as working-class families gained access to home entertainment that previously had been available only in public venues, beginning a process of declining pub attendance that would accelerate during subsequent decades as home-centered leisure activities increasingly displaced the social patterns that had made pubs essential community institutions. The emergence of youth culture during the late 1950s and early 1960s brought generational changes in drinking patterns, with younger customers seeking louder, more energetic environments than traditional pubs provided, leading to the development of youth-oriented venues, including coffee bars and later discotheques that competed for younger customers, while traditional pubs retained older clientele, comfortable with established social patterns but failed to attract younger generations whose allegiance would be necessary for long-term viability. The relaxation of liquor licensing restrictions proceeded gradually during this period, with extensions of permitted opening hours and removal of some wartime restrictions representing partial liberalization, while maintaining the fundamentally restrictive framework that continued treating pubs as privileges requiring official approval rather than as freely exercised commercial enterprises. The social changes of the 1960s and 1970s profoundly challenged traditional pub culture, with shifting gender roles, changing class structures, the decline of traditional industries, suburban expansion, increased automobile ownership, and the rise of alternative leisure activities, combining to undermine the social foundations that had sustained neighborhood pubs as central community institutions, forcing publicans and brewing companies to adapt their operations or face declining revenues and potential closure. The Campaign for Real Ale, launched by the Campaign for Real Ale, CAMRA, in 1971, represented a consumer revolt against the dominance of keg beer and the standardization of pub experiences under corporate brewery control, advocating for the preservation of traditional cask-conditioned ale and the independent pubs that served it, creating a movement that would significantly influence pub culture and brewing practices during subsequent decades by establishing alternative values, emphasizing quality, tradition, and local distinctiveness against corporate standardization. The proliferation of theme pubs during the 1970s and 1980s reflected brewing companies' attempts to differentiate their establishments and attract customers in increasingly competitive leisure markets, with themed concepts ranging from Victorian recreations to Irish pubs, sports bars, and various other formats designed to create distinctive identities and appeal to specific customer segments. Though critics complained that these themes often represented artificial constructions bearing little relationship to authentic pub traditions or local communities. The expansion of pub food service during this period transformed many establishments from primarily drinking venues into dining destinations, with publicans recognizing that food sales could generate revenue from customers who might spend only limited amounts on beverages, while attracting families and other demographics who would not patronize establishments offering only alcohol, leading to the development of pub restaurants and the widespread adoption of food service as a standard pub amenity rather than an optional addition. The introduction of fruit machines and other electronic gaming devices provided additional revenue streams while changing the atmosphere of pubs where these devices were installed, with the beeping and flashing of gaming machines creating soundscapes different from the conversation-centered environments of traditional pubs, while generating concerns about problem gambling and the appropriateness of gaming in establishments already controversial for their association with alcohol consumption. The decline in pub numbers accelerated during the late 20th century as economic pressures, changing consumer preferences, and property development opportunities led brewing companies to close establishments that no longer generated adequate returns, with rates of closure reaching 20 to 30 pubs per week during some periods, eliminating thousands of neighborhood establishments and transforming the geography of English drinking culture. The privatization of brewing companies and their subsequent restructuring during the 1980s and 1990s disrupted the traditional tied house system as private equity investors purchased major brewers and subsequently sold off their pub estates, creating pub companies, or pubcos, that owned retail properties but did not brew beer, separating property ownership from production and creating new organizational forms that would dominate the industry during subsequent decades. The beer orders of 1989, implemented by the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, attempted to reduce the market power of large brewers by limiting the number of tied houses they could own and requiring them to offer guest beers in their establishments, leading to the disposal of thousands of pubs that brewing companies sold to pubcos or independent operators, fundamentally restructuring the industry's organization while achieving only limited success in enhancing competition or reducing retail prices. The emergence of superpubs during the 1990s brought large format establishments designed to accommodate hundreds of customers with extended opening hours, aggressive marketing to younger demographics, and operational models emphasizing volume sales at competitive prices, past, creating venues that bore little resemblance to traditional neighborhood pubs, while attracting controversy for their association with binge drinking and alcohol-related disorder. The liberalization of opening hours through the Licensing Act of 2003 eliminated the traditional afternoon closure and the 11 p.m. last call that had structured pub operations since World War I, allowing establishments to apply for 24-hour licenses and creating more flexible schedules that proponents argued would encourage moderate drinking by eliminating the pressure to consume rapidly before closing time. Though the reforms generated controversy and their effects on drinking patterns and alcohol-related problems remain debated. The craft beer revolution, beginning in the early 21st century, brought renewed diversity to English brewing and new energy to pub culture, with small independent brewers producing flavorful beers using traditional methods and innovative ingredients that contrasted with the standardized products of industrial brewers, creating consumer enthusiasm that supported the growth of specialist beer pubs and the revival of cask ale in establishments that had abandoned it during the keg beer era. The development of micropubs representing a return to basic pub concepts, emphasizing quality beer service in simple surroundings, without gaming machines, food service, or other distractions that had proliferated in larger establishments, attracted customers seeking authentic drinking experiences and creating a new category of small-scale neighborhood establishments that reference traditional pub values while adapting them to contemporary contexts. The expansion of pub dining during the early 21st century reached the point where many establishments derived the majority of their revenue from food sales rather than beverage service, transforming the essential nature of pubs and raising questions about whether food-focused establishments properly constituted pubs at all, or represented a different category of business that happened to occupy premises traditionally used for drinking establishments. The smoking ban, implemented in 2007, prohibited tobacco smoking in enclosed public spaces, including pubs, eliminating practices that had been integral to pub culture for centuries while improving air quality and working conditions for staff, though generating concerns about effects on business viability and social dynamics as dedicated smokers reduced their pub attendance or shifted their custom to establishments with outdoor spaces where smoking remained permitted. The economic crisis of 2008 and subsequent austerity measures brought financial pressures that accelerated pub closures and forced surviving establishments to adapt through cost reductions, operational efficiencies, and intensified efforts to attract customers in harsh economic conditions, where discretionary spending declined and home drinking became increasingly attractive, as supermarket alcohol prices remained substantially below pub rates. The continuing decline in pub numbers during the 21st century reflects multiple challenges, including changing social patterns with younger generations, socializing through digital media rather than in physical venues, increased home entertainment options, providing alternatives to pub-centered leisure, concerns about alcohol consumption and drunk driving, reducing customer willingness to visit pubs regularly, high operating costs, including rent, staff wages, and regulatory compliance expenses, reducing profitability, and competition from other leisure activities, including restaurants, cinemas, and various entertainment venues competing for consumer spending. The preservation of historic pubs through heritage designations and community campaigns reflects recognition that pub buildings represent important elements of England's architectural and social heritage, deserving protection against demolition or conversion to other uses. With organisations including CAMRA, the Victorian Society, and various local preservation groups advocating for the retention of significant pubs and sometimes purchasing threatened establishments as community assets. The development of community-owned pubs represents an innovative response to pub closures in small villages and urban neighbourhoods where commercial operators cannot sustain viable businesses, with local residents forming cooperatives or community benefit societies that purchase establishments and operate them as community assets rather than purely commercial ventures, creating governance structures that prioritise social benefits alongside financial sustainability. The adaptation of pubs to contemporary consumer preferences includes embracing specialty coffee service, craft cocktails, local sourcing of food and beverages, hosting of community events including quiz nights and live music, provision of workspaces for remote workers, and other innovations that expand the traditional pub concept while maintaining core elements including alcohol service and social gathering functions. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2020 brought unprecedented disruption to pub operations through government-mandated closures, capacity restrictions, social distancing requirements, and shifts in consumer behaviour that accelerated trends toward home drinking and outdoor dining, while creating financial crises that forced many establishments to close permanently, potentially marking a watershed moment in the history of English pubs, comparable to the disruptions of the World Wars. The geographic diversity of England's pub culture manifests through distinctive regional variations that reflect centuries of localised development shaped by differential access to brewing materials, water chemistry, transportation networks, economic structures, and cultural traditions, creating a mosaic of drinking establishments whose characteristics varied substantially from the industrial north to the agricultural south, from maritime East Anglia to the pastoral West Country, from the densely populated urban centres to the isolated rural villages that dotted the countryside. The geology of different regions influenced beer production through the mineral composition of local water sources, with Burton-on-Trent's gypsum-rich water proving particularly suitable for pale ale production during the 19th century, creating brewing industries concentrated in specific locations that developed distinctive beer styles associated with their places of origin, while the availability of particular hop varieties grown in Kent and other hop-growing regions shaped the flavour profiles of beers produced in proximity to these agricultural areas. The distribution of coalfields and industrial development during the 18th and 19th centuries created concentrations of working-class populations in northern England, the Midlands, and South Wales, fostering pub cultures centred on industrial workers whose drinking patterns differed from those of agricultural labourers in southern and eastern England, with industrial pubs often featuring large public bars designed to accommodate substantial numbers of workers seeking refreshment after shifts in mills, mines, and factories, while rural pubs in agricultural regions maintained smaller scales appropriate to dispersed populations and seasonal work patterns that brought workers together during harvest periods and market days, but left them isolated on individual farms during much of the year. The architectural character of regional pub types reflected these economic and social differences, with the substantial urban pubs of Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and other industrial cities displaying Victorian grandeur through elaborate tilework, etched glass, ornate woodwork, and multiple rooms designed to accommodate different social classes within single establishments through spatial segregation that maintained class hierarchies while allowing diverse populations to patronize the same venues, contrasting with the simpler structures of rural alehouses that might consist of a single room in a converted cottage or farmhouse where the publican's family lived alongside the drinking space, creating intimate environments that blurred distinctions between domestic and commercial spaces in ways that urban pubs increasingly did not, as licensing regulations and brewing company ownership imposed standardization. The Georgian coaching inns, concentrated along major transportation routes, displayed architectural features designed to accommodate travelers and their horses, with large courtyards, extensive stabling facilities, multiple dining rooms, and overnight accommodation, creating complex structures that serve diverse functions beyond simple beverage service. While the smaller beer houses authorized under the Beer Act of 1831 often occupied modest buildings that could not compete architecturally with established alehouses and inns, but offered cheaper beer that attracted working-class customers who could not afford the prices charged by licensed victuallers offering spirits and wine alongside beer. London's pub culture developed its own distinctive characteristics that differentiated metropolitan drinking establishments from provincial ones. With the capital's size, wealth, and social diversity, creating a broader range of pub types, serving different markets, from elegant gin palaces in the West End attracting middle-class customers, to rough dockside taverns in the East End, frequented by sailors and dock workers, from the theatrical pubs near Drury Lane and the Haymarket hosting actors and theatre-goers, to the political pubs in Westminster, where members of Parliament and journalists gathered to discuss affairs of state over drinks. The development of the London brewing industry during the 18th century, when porter production transformed brewing from a predominantly local craft into an industrial enterprise capable of producing thousands of barrels annually, created tied house systems earlier and more extensively than in other regions, with major brewers like Whitbread, Truman's, and Charrington acquiring hundreds of pubs that they supplied exclusively with their own products, establishing patterns of vertical integration that would eventually spread throughout England, but originated in the capital's concentration of brewing capacity and retail outlets. The Underground's expansion during the late 19th and early 20th centuries influenced pub locations, as new stations created opportunities for establishments near transportation hubs, while the suburban expansion, enabled by rail and underground services, led to the construction of new pubs in developing residential areas, creating networks of establishments that served commuters and local residents in neighborhoods that had not existed a generation earlier. The architectural evolution of English pubs proceeded through phases, reflecting changing social attitudes, economic conditions, technological capabilities, and regulatory requirements, with medieval alehouses typically occupying undifferentiated rooms in domestic buildings where alewives sold home-brewed products to neighbors, creating drinking spaces that lacked specialized design features or dedicated commercial architecture. The development of purpose-built taverns during the 16th and 17th centuries introduced structures designed specifically for hospitality functions, with public rooms for drinking and dining, private chambers for overnight guests, and service areas, including kitchens, cellars, and staff accommodations, though many establishments continued operating in converted domestic buildings rather than purpose-built commercial structures. The coaching inn era of the 18th century produced substantial buildings designed to accommodate travelers and their horses, with large gated yards providing access to stabling and storage areas, ground-floor public rooms offering drinking and dining facilities, and upper-floor chambers providing overnight accommodation, creating complex structures that represented significant capital investments by landlords who catered to wealthy travelers willing to pay premium prices for superior accommodations and services. The Victorian era transformed pub architecture through the introduction of plate glass, decorative tilework, elaborate woodwork, etched and colored glass, and other ornamental features that created visually impressive establishments designed to attract customers and demonstrate the prosperity of brewing companies that increasingly owned retail properties. The gin palace phenomenon, beginning in the 1830s, established templates for ostentatious pub design featuring brilliant gaslighting, extensive mirrors that amplified light and created illusions of spaciousness, mahogany bars with elaborate fittings, and sumptuous decorations that contrasted dramatically with the drab exteriors and interiors of working-class housing, creating palatial environments accessible to common people who possessed a few pence for drinks. The development of specialized pub architects and designers during the mid-19th century professionalized pub construction, with practitioners like Alfred Waterhouse, Edward Holmes, and other architects producing buildings that applied contemporary architectural fashions, including Gothic Revival, Jacobean Revival, and arts and crafts aesthetics, to commercial drinking establishments, elevating pub design from vernacular building traditions to professionally designed structures, incorporating fashionable stylistic elements. The internal spatial organization of Victorian pubs reflected and reinforced social hierarchies through the provision of multiple rooms and drinking areas designed for different social classes, with public bars offering basic accommodations and cheap drinks for working-class customers, private bars providing more comfortable seating and slightly higher prices for lower middle-class patrons, saloon bars featuring superior furnishings and substantial price premiums for middle-class customers seeking to distance themselves from working-class drinkers, and snug rooms offering privacy and exclusivity for customers willing to pay the highest prices for drinks served in intimate spaces separated from public view. This spatial segregation allowed single establishments to serve diverse clienteles while maintaining class distinctions through architectural means, with physical barriers, including walls, partitions, and separate entrances, ensuring that different social groups rarely encountered each other despite occupying the same building simultaneously. The gradual elimination of these internal divisions during the 20th century reflected changing social attitudes that increasingly rejected explicit class segregation, with many pubs removing partitions to create open-plan interiors that encouraged mixing among customers of different social backgrounds, though economic segregation persisted through price differentials that continued directing different economic classes toward establishments appropriate to their incomes. The interwar period introduced modernist aesthetics to pub architecture through roadhouse designs that emphasized horizontal lines, flat roofs, metal-framed windows, and streamlined details appealing to motorists seeking contemporary environments that contrasted with traditional pub architecture, though this modernist trend remained limited primarily to new suburban developments and roadside locations, while established urban and rural pubs maintained traditional architectural vocabularies. The post-World War II reconstruction period saw substantial new pub construction in expanding suburbs and new towns, with designs reflecting contemporary architectural movements, including brutalism and international style, modernism, that sometimes produced controversial buildings that departed dramatically from traditional pub architecture, generating debates about whether modern designs suited institutions associated with historical continuity and traditional social functions. The preservation movement beginning in the 1960s recognized the architectural and historical significance of Victorian pubs, with organizations including the Campaign for Real Ale, the Victorian Society, and English Heritage advocating for the protection of significant pub buildings and interiors against demolition or unsympathetic alterations that would destroy historically important features. The establishment of conservation areas and listed building designations provided legal protection for architecturally significant pubs, though economic pressures often threatened protected buildings when pubs closed and property developers sought permission to convert structures to other uses or demolish them entirely to redevelop sites. The National Inventory of Historic Pub Interiors, initiated by CAMRA in the 1980s, documented and categorized historically significant pub interiors, creating a systematic record of surviving Victorian and Edwardian fittings, including bars, snugs, partitions, glasswork, tilework, and other features that represented threatened elements of pub architecture vulnerable to removal during refurbishments that modernized establishments at the expense of historical character. The economic structures governing pub operations evolved substantially from the medieval period, when alewives brewed and sold beer in their homes through increasingly complex systems of ownership, supply, and regulation that created relationships between brewers, property owners, and publicans, characterized by varying degrees of independence and control. The development of common brewers during the 16th and 17th centuries created specialized producers who supplied multiple retailers rather than brewing for on-premises consumption only, introducing wholesale relationships between producers and sellers that differentiated the roles that had been combined when publicans brewed their own beer. The emergence of porter brewing as an industrial enterprise during the 18th century accelerated this separation of production and retail, as large-scale brewers required extensive capital investments in equipment, facilities, and raw materials that exceeded the resources available to most publicans, creating economic conditions favoring specialization, where publicans focused on retail operations while purchasing beer from breweries that achieved economies of scale through large volume production. The tied house system that dominated English pub operations during the 19th and much of the 20th century originated in the financial arrangements between brewers and publicans, with brewers providing loans to publicans for building improvements, equipment purchases, or other capital investments in exchange for exclusive agreements requiring publicans to purchase beer only from the lending brewery, creating contractual relationships that bound retailers to specific suppliers through financial obligations that practically eliminated publicans' ability to switch suppliers or negotiate better terms from competing brewers. The Victorian period saw this system expanding dramatically as major brewers acquired freehold ownership of retail properties outright, rather than relying solely on loan agreements, purchasing existing pubs and constructing new establishments that they owned directly and operated either through salaried managers or tenants who leased properties under agreements, requiring them to purchase beer exclusively from the property-owning brewery at prices and on terms determined by the landlord, rather than through arm's-length commercial negotiations between independent parties. The late 19th century consolidation of brewing industries through mergers and acquisitions created increasingly large brewing companies, controlling hundreds or thousands of tied houses, with companies including Bass, Guinness, Watney's, and Whitbread dominating national and regional markets through vertical integration that controlled both production and retail distribution, eliminating competition and enabling brewers to command premium prices while reducing the portion of retail revenue flowing to publicans who operated properties under tenancy agreements that shifted business risks onto tenants, while brewers retained ownership of appreciating property assets and guaranteed outlets for their products, regardless of market conditions. The interwar period saw continued consolidation, reducing the number of independent brewers and free houses, while increasing the market dominance of major brewing companies, whose tied house estates grew through aggressive acquisition, campaigns that purchased competitors along with their pub estates, creating oligopolistic market structures characterized by limited competition and high barriers to entry that prevented new entrants from challenging established firms' market positions. The post-World War II period witnessed further concentration of brewing ownership through continued mergers that created even larger companies, while reducing the total number of brewing firms, with the 1960s and 70s seeing particularly intensive consolidation that transformed British brewing from an industry characterized by numerous regional firms into an oligopoly dominated by a handful of national corporations controlling substantial market shares and extensive pub estates numbering thousands of properties each. The emergence of pub companies or pubcasts during the 1980s and 90s represented a new phase in the evolution of pub ownership structures, with private equity investors purchasing brewery companies and subsequently divesting their brewing operations while retaining pub estates, creating specialized property companies that owned retail sites but did not brew beer, fundamentally restructuring industry organization by separating property ownership from production in ways that previous arrangements had not, though pubcasts maintained supply arrangements with brewers that preserved elements of tied house relationships in new organizational forms. The Beer Orders of 1989, implemented by the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, attempted to reduce the market power of large brewers by limiting the number of tied houses they could own and requiring them to offer guest beers from other brewers in their establishments, aiming to increase competition and provide consumers with greater choice while reducing the vertical integration that critics argued enabled brewers to charge excessive prices and limit product diversity. The orders achieved limited success in their stated objectives, as brewers responded by selling pub estates to newly formed pub companies that maintained supply relationships with former parent brewers, while technically complying with ownership restrictions, creating organizational structures that preserved economic relationships under different legal forms without substantially increasing competition or reducing prices. The disposal of thousands of pubs by major brewers to pubcos during the 1990s fundamentally restructured pub ownership, creating a new industry segment, characterized by property companies that owned retail sites but did not brew beer, though supply agreements with brewers often maintained practical ties between specific pubcos and brewing companies despite legal separation of ownership. The economic pressures facing pub operators intensified during the late 20th and early 21st centuries as rising property values, increasing regulatory costs, higher labor expenses, and competition from supermarket alcohol sales and alternative leisure activities reduced profitability and forced marginal establishments to close, while survivors adapted operations to maintain viability in increasingly challenging business environments. The high operating costs, including rent, staff wages, utility expenses, insurance premiums, licensing fees, and regulatory compliance costs, required substantial revenues to sustain profitable operations, with many pubs struggling to generate sufficient income as customer numbers declined and competition intensified from both on-trade competitors, including restaurants and bars, and off-trade retail through supermarkets selling alcohol at prices significantly below pub rates due to economies of scale and different cost structures. The proliferation of entertainment options, including home video, cable, and satellite television, internet streaming services, video gaming, and numerous other leisure activities, provided alternatives to pub going that particularly attracted younger consumers who increasingly socialized through digital media rather than physical venues, reducing the centrality of pubs in social life and forcing establishments to compete more aggressively for customers through enhanced food offerings, entertainment programming, improved facilities, and other strategies designed to differentiate individual pubs from competitors and attract customers despite abundant alternatives. The social functions of pubs extended beyond simple beverage service to encompass roles including community centers, political forums, labor exchanges, commercial meeting places, entertainment venues, and spaces for civic association that made pubs important institutions in English social life, performing functions that transcended their narrow commercial purposes as retail alcohol outlets. The role of pubs as informal labor exchanges, where workers and employers connected, predated formal employment agencies, and continued alongside them, with many working-class occupations, including dock work, construction labor, and other casual employment arrangements, relying on pub-based hiring, where workers gathered in establishments known to employers, who recruited labor from the assembled men, according to daily needs, creating casual labor markets centered on pubs that performed important economic functions, facilitating employment relationships, despite the inefficiencies and inequities of systems that advantaged workers, known personally to hiring agents, while disadvantaging strangers and newcomers without established connections. The use of pubs for political meetings and working-class organization reflected their status as one of few spaces accessible to common people outside homes and workplaces, with Chartist meetings, trade union gatherings, friendly society assemblies, and other working-class political and social organizations frequently conducting business in pubs whose landlords rented rooms for meetings that brought groups of paying customers into establishments where attendees consumed drinks before, during, and after official proceedings, creating mutually beneficial arrangements that provided organizations with meeting spaces while generating revenue for publicans. The development of working men's clubs during the 19th century partly reflected dissatisfaction with pub-based meeting arrangements that required organizations to pay commercial rates for room rentals while generating profits for publicans and brewers, with club advocates arguing that working men would benefit from member-owned facilities where profits could be distributed among members or used to enhance club facilities and services, rather than enriching commercial operators. Though clubs competed with pubs for working-class custom and generated tensions between commercial publicans who viewed clubs as unfair competition, operating under preferential regulatory treatment, and club members who valued the ITNDA, cooperative ownership structure, and cost savings that club membership provided. The role of pubs in facilitating informal social welfare through networks of mutual assistance among regulars who aided each other during periods of unemployment, illness, or other hardship represented important social functions that official welfare systems did not fully replace until the mid-20th century. Development of comprehensive social insurance and public assistance programs reduced dependence on informal mutual aid. The tradition of regular customers, maintaining accounts with publicans who extended credit to trusted patrons, created financial relationships that helped working-class families manage irregular incomes and unexpected expenses. Though these arrangements also created dependencies and sometimes led to exploitation when publicans charged excessive interest or used debt obligations to pressure customers into accepting unfavorable terms, highlighting the ambiguous nature of paternalistic social relationships that provided important assistance while potentially enabling exploitation of vulnerable individuals who lacked alternative resources. The entertainment functions of pubs expanded during the 19th and 20th centuries to include musical performances, theatrical presentations, sports viewing, games, including darts, pool, skittles, and various traditional pub games, quiz nights, and numerous other activities that transformed pubs from simple drinking establishments into entertainment venues, providing diverse leisure opportunities. The tradition of music halls emerging from pub concert rooms during the mid-19th century illustrated how pubs served as incubators for commercial entertainment forms that eventually outgrew their pub origins to become major industries, with early music halls operating as extensions of pubs, where landlords charged admission to entertainment performances while selling drinks to audiences, creating hybrid commercial models that combined elements of theatrical entertainment with traditional pub operations. The development of pub sports, including dominoes, leagues, darts, competitions, pool tournaments, and other organized recreational activities, created social structures that brought regulars together for activities beyond simple drinking, fostering communities united by shared interests and competitive spirits that strengthened social bonds among participants, while generating customer loyalty for establishments that hosted these activities. The brewing traditions associated with English pubs encompass the production of diverse beer styles, reflecting regional preferences, technological capabilities, ingredient availability, and consumer tastes that evolved substantially from medieval times through the contemporary craft beer era. The dominance of ale production in medieval and early modern England reflected the absence of refrigeration technology that prevented the bottom fermentation processes required for lager production, with traditional English ales using top fermenting yeast strains that operated effectively at ambient temperatures without refrigeration, creating brewing methods suited to technological limitations while producing beers whose characteristics differed substantially from the lagers that would dominate global beer markets after refrigeration technology enabled bottom fermentation anywhere. The distinction between ale and beer in medieval usage referred to the presence or absence of hops, with ale indicating unhopped beverages and beer denoting hopped products, though this terminology eventually shifted such that ale came to designate top fermented products regardless of hopping, while beer became a general term, encompassing all fermented malt beverages regardless of fermentation method or hop content. The introduction of hops to English brewing during the 15th century transformed beer production by providing preservative and flavoring properties that extended shelf life, while adding bitterness that balanced malt sweetness, though hop adoption proceeded gradually against resistance from traditionalists who preferred unhopped ales and suspicious authorities who sometimes attempted to prohibit hop use as a foreign adulterant incompatible with authentic English. Brewing traditions. The eventual triumph of hopped beer over unhopped ale reflected the practical advantages of improved preservation and flavor complexity that hops provided, with English brewers eventually adopting hops universally while developing distinctive hop varieties, including Fuggles and Goldings, that became associated with English beer styles and remained important even after American and New World. Hop varieties gained market share during the late 20th century craft beer movement. The development of pale ale during the 19th century represented a significant innovation in English brewing, with Burton-on-Trent emerging as the centre of pale ale production due to its gypsum-rich water that proved particularly suitable for this beer style, creating a brewing industry concentrated in a specific location due to natural resource advantages that could not be easily replicated elsewhere, despite efforts by brewers in other regions to artificially recreate Burton water chemistry through additions that approximated its mineral composition. The porter revolution of the 18th century transformed English brewing through the development of a dark beer style, suited to industrial production methods that enabled economies of scale previously impossible in brewing industries, characterized by small-scale operations serving local markets, with London brewers, including Whitbread, Truman's, and others producing porter in quantities reaching thousands of barrels annually, using steam engines, thermometers, hydrometers, and other industrial technologies that rationalized and mechanized brewing processes previously dependent on craft knowledge and manual labor. The enormous vats used for porter aging and storage became tourist attractions and sources of civic pride as Londoners visited breweries to view these impressive containers holding hundreds of thousands of gallons. Though the catastrophic failure of a giant vat at the Moe Brewery in 1814 killed 8 people when released, beer flooded surrounding neighborhoods, illustrating the dangers associated with industrial-scale brewing operations that concentrated enormous quantities of beer in single locations. The eventual decline of porter during the late 19th century, as consumer preferences shifted toward lighter beers, including pale ales and milds, demonstrated how beer styles rose and fell according to changing tastes, rather than following linear progressions, with porter's revival during the late 20th century craft beer movement, showing how historical styles could be rediscovered and reinterpreted for contemporary markets. The campaign for real ale's influence on English brewing culture, beginning in the 1970s, revitalized traditional cask-conditioned ales that large brewers had increasingly abandoned in favor of keg beers using dials, pasteurization, and pressurized dispensing systems that simplified cellar management while standardizing products and extending shelf life at the cost of flavor, complexity, and regional distinctiveness that characterized traditionally produced cask ales. CAMRA's advocacy emphasized quality, tradition, and diversity against the homogenization and standardization that corporate brewing seemed to represent, creating a consumer movement that successfully reversed declining cask ale production and prevented the complete elimination of traditional brewing methods that had appeared likely during the 1960s, when major brewers systematically replaced cask ales with keg products. The success of CAMRA's campaign demonstrated that consumer preferences mattered in shaping industry practices, and that organized consumer activism could influence corporate strategies in industries dominated by large firms. Market power might otherwise enable them to dictate product offerings without meaningful consumer input or resistance. The craft beer revolution beginning in the early 21st century built on CAMRA's foundation while extending innovation beyond traditional English styles to embrace American, Belgian, German, and other international brewing traditions, along with experimental approaches that pushed boundaries of established styles through innovative ingredients, techniques, and flavor profiles that sometimes provoked controversy among traditionalists who questioned whether extreme beers represented authentic craft or gimmickry designed to attract attention through novelty rather than quality. The proliferation of microbreweries and brewpubs during the 2000s and thousands represented the most significant expansion of brewing diversity since before 20th century consolidation had reduced England to a handful of major brewers dominating national markets, with hundreds of new small brewers entering the market, producing diverse products for local and regional consumption, reversing the homogenization of previous decades while creating consumer choices that had not existed for generations. The emphasis on local sourcing, traditional methods, and small batch production aligned craft brewing with broader cultural movements, valuing authenticity, localism, and artisanal production methods over industrial standardization and mass production, creating cultural resonances that extended beyond brewing to reflect anxieties about globalization and desires for connections to place and tradition that industrialized food and beverage production seemed to sever. The legal and regulatory frameworks governing pub operations evolved through centuries of legislation, administrative rulemaking, and judicial interpretation that created complex systems controlling licensing, operating hours, permitted activities, building standards, health and safety requirements, and numerous other aspects of pub operations that publicans navigated while attempting to maintain profitable businesses, complying with extensive regulations. The medieval system of alehouse regulation operated through local manorial courts and parish authorities that licensed alehouses and alewives while attempting to prevent disorderly conduct and maintain quality standards through regular inspections and enforcement actions, though the effectiveness of these regulatory systems varied substantially across jurisdictions, depending on the diligence of local authorities and their willingness to prosecute violations. The development of justice of the peace licensing during the 16th century represented a significant centralization of regulatory authority, with JPs appointed by the Crown assuming responsibility for granting licenses and supervising alehouses in their jurisdictions, creating systems that connected local regulation to national governance, while enabling more systematic enforcement of standards and policies. The proliferation of regulations during the Victorian era reflected middle-class reformers' concerns about working-class drinking and desires to impose order on institutions they viewed as sources of social disorder and moral degradation, with licensing laws restricting operating hours, prohibiting certain activities, including gambling and prostitution, requiring licenses for entertainment performances, and imposing building standards designed to prevent dangerous overcrowding while facilitating police supervision of potentially disorderly establishments. The temperance movement's political influence peaked during the early 20th century, with seriously debated proposals for prohibition that ultimately failed to achieve majority support, despite generating significant legislative restrictions, including the licensing reforms of World War I that limited operating hours and reduced the number of licensed premises through policies justified as wartime necessities, but maintained afterward, despite the end of military conflict. The gradual liberalization of licensing restrictions during the late 20th century reversed some Victorian-era regulations, while maintaining fundamental frameworks, treating pubs as privileges, requiring official approval rather than commercial enterprises freely established without government permission, reflecting continuing ambivalence about alcohol's place in society and skepticism about whether market forces alone could adequately regulate industries with significant public health and social order implications. The Licensing Act of 2003 represented the most significant liberalization of English licensing law in a century, eliminating the traditional afternoon closure requirement and the 11 p.m. last call that had structured pub operations since World War I, allowing establishments to apply for 24-hour licenses that theoretically enabled continuous operation throughout the day and night, though in practice most pubs maintained relatively traditional hours, while taking advantage of modestly extended evening hours that allowed them to remain open past the traditional 11 p.m. closing time. The reform generated extensive debate about whether extended hours would encourage moderate drinking by eliminating the pressure to consume rapidly before mandatory closing, or would increase alcohol consumption and related problems by providing additional hours for drinking, with opponents predicting surges in alcohol-related disorder and health problems, while proponents argued that continental European models demonstrated that extended hours, combined with cultural shifts toward more responsible drinking, could reduce problems associated with rapid alcohol consumption concentrated in narrow time windows. The actual effects of the reforms remain contested, with different studies reaching conflicting conclusions about whether extended hours increased, decreased, or had no significant effect on alcohol-related problems, illustrating the difficulties of isolating the impacts of single policy changes within complex social systems where multiple factors influence drinking behaviors and their consequences. The regulatory burden facing contemporary pub operators includes licensing requirements, health and safety regulations, food hygiene standards, employment laws, tax obligations, building codes, disability access requirements, noise restrictions, and numerous other regulatory compliance obligations that collectively impose substantial costs on operators, while potentially creating barriers to entry that disadvantage small operators and new entrants relative to large chains with dedicated compliance staff and economies of scale that distribute regulatory costs across multiple establishments. The smoking ban, implemented in 2007, represented a major regulatory intervention that prohibited tobacco smoking in enclosed public spaces, including pubs, fundamentally altering the atmosphere and operations of establishments where smoking had been prevalent, and forcing publicans to adapt through the provision of outdoor smoking areas, improved ventilation systems, and strategies to retain customers who might reduce their pub attendance if they could not smoke while drinking. The ban generated intense controversy before implementation, with predictions that pubs would suffer catastrophic revenue losses from departing smokers, though actual impacts proved less severe than feared, as many pubs adapted successfully, while public health advocates cited evidence of improved air quality and reduced staff exposure to secondhand smoke as justifying the restrictions, despite their impacts on businesses and individual liberties. The international influences on English pub culture included the importation of foreign beer styles, drinking customs, and establishment formats that enriched domestic drinking culture, while potentially diluting distinctive national characteristics. As globalization increased cultural exchange and reduced the isolation that had previously protected local traditions from external influences. The increasing availability of continental European beers, including German lagers, Belgian ales, and other imports during the late 20th century, expanded consumer choice while challenging the dominance of traditional English styles, with some pubs specializing in imported beers, appealing to cosmopolitan consumers interested in international brewing traditions. The influence of Irish pubs, both authentic establishments operated by Irish immigrants and themed venues operated by brewery companies and pub chains, seeking to capitalize on perceived Irish pub authenticity and conviviality, introduced Irish drinking customs and aesthetics to English pub culture, though critics questioned whether themed Irish pubs represented genuine cultural transmission or superficial commercial exploitation of ethnic stereotypes for profit. The American influence on English pub culture became increasingly apparent during the late 20th and early 21st centuries through the adoption of American craft brewing techniques, beer styles, and aesthetic approaches that emphasized bold flavors, high alcohol contents, and innovative ingredients, contrasting with traditional English brewing conservatism, creating hybrid Anglo-American beer cultures that blended traditions from both sides of the Atlantic. The export of English pub culture to former British colonies and other countries created international drinking establishments, claiming authenticity through English names, decorative schemes, and beverage offerings. Though these establishments often represented romanticized or idealized versions of pub culture, bearing limited resemblance to actual English pubs, while serving expatriate communities and locals attracted to perceived English sophistication or tradition. The proliferation of English-themed pubs in countries including the United States, Australia, Canada, and numerous others demonstrated the international appeal of English drinking culture, while raising questions about what essential characteristics constituted authentic pub culture and whether establishments far removed from their English contexts could legitimately claim pub status or represented merely themed bars exploiting superficial English aesthetics without understanding or replicating the social functions and community roles that pubs performed in their native contexts. The franchising of pub concepts by international brewing and hospitality companies created standardized branded establishments, claiming English authenticity while operating according to corporate protocols that prioritized consistency, profitability over the idiosyncrasies and local distinctiveness that characterized traditional pubs, generating tensions between commercial imperatives towards standardization and cultural values, emphasizing authenticity and local character. The future trajectory of English pub culture remains uncertain as institutions face continuing challenges from economic pressures, regulatory burdens, changing consumer preferences, and competition from alternative leisure activities. Though opportunities exist for pubs that successfully adapt to contemporary conditions while maintaining connections to historical traditions that give pubs cultural significance extending beyond their immediate commercial functions. The The community pub movement, advocating for local ownership and operation of establishments through cooperative structures or community benefit societies, represents an innovative response to pub closures that attempts to preserve important local institutions that commercial operators cannot sustain profitably, creating governance structures that prioritize social benefits alongside financial sustainability and allow communities to retain establishments that might otherwise disappear when their commercial viability ends. The increasing emphasis on food service as a revenue source has transformed many pubs into dining destinations where beverage service supplements restaurant operations rather than constituting the primary business focus, raising questions about whether food-focused establishments remain pubs in any meaningful sense or represent different types of businesses, operating in buildings historically used as pubs, but now serving different primary functions. The craft beer movement's emphasis on quality, diversity, and traditional brewing methods provides opportunities for pubs to differentiate themselves from chain establishments and supermarket alcohol sales through offerings that emphasize expertise, curation, and the social experience of drinking in communal spaces that home consumption cannot replicate, potentially reversing the decline in pub attendance among consumers who value these characteristics sufficiently to pay the price premiums that pub operation requires. The development of micropubs, representing a return to basic pub concepts, emphasizing beer quality and conversation without the distractions of food service, gaming machines, or entertainment that have proliferated in larger establishments, demonstrates that successful pub models need not involve extensive facilities or diversified offerings, but can thrive through focusing narrowly on core functions of providing quality drinks in comfortable environments, facilitating social interaction. The preservation of historic pubs through heritage designation and community campaigns reflects recognition that pub buildings and the institutions they house represent important elements of English, architectural, and social heritage, deserving protection against economic pressures that might otherwise lead to their destruction or conversion to uses that would eliminate their historic characters and social functions. The resilience of pub culture, despite persistent challenges, suggests that drinking establishments continue serving important social functions that alternative institutions and activities have not fully replaced, with pubs providing spaces for face-to-face social interaction in an increasingly digital age, where much socializing occurs through electronic media that substitutes mediated communication for physical co-presence. The continuing appeal of pubs for significant portions of the English population indicates that desires for communal drinking spaces remain strong despite abundant alternatives, and that pubs adapted successfully enough to contemporary conditions to maintain relevance for consumers whose leisure preferences and social needs they continue serving effectively. The diversity of contemporary pub formats, ranging from traditional alehouses to gastropubs to chain establishments to community-owned cooperatives, demonstrates that multiple viable pub models exist, serving different markets, fulfilling different functions within the broader category of English drinking establishments, suggesting that the future of pub culture lies not in single formats or approaches, but in the continued evolution and adaptation of diverse establishment types, serving varied consumer preferences and community needs, while maintaining connections to the historical traditions and social functions that have made pubs central institutions in English social life for centuries. The examination of pub culture through regional, architectural, literary, economic, social, brewing, and international perspectives reveals an institution of remarkable complexity, whose significance extends far beyond simple commercial alcohol sales, to encompass roles including community centers, cultural symbols, architectural heritage, literary settings, economic enterprises, social welfare institutions, entertainment venues, and political forums that collectively made pubs among the most important institutions in English social life across centuries of continuous development and adaptation. The ability of pubs to persist through dramatic social, economic, and technological changes that eliminated or fundamentally transformed numerous other traditional institutions demonstrates adaptability and resilience, reflecting pubs' capacity to evolve while maintaining core functions and high intent. characteristics that enabled them to remain relevant across vastly different historical contexts, from medieval villages through industrial cities to contemporary suburbs and rural communities. The regional diversity of pub cultures, the architectural richness of pub buildings, the extensive literary representations of pub life, the complex economic structures governing pub operations, the multiple social functions pubs performed, the diverse brewing traditions associated with pubs, the elaborate regulatory frameworks controlling pub activities, and the international dimensions of pub culture collectively illustrate how examining drinking establishments from multiple analytical perspectives reveals institutions whose complexity and importance exceeded what superficial analyses, focusing narrowly on alcohol retail, might suggest. The enduring presence of pubs in contemporary England, despite challenges that have eliminated thousands of establishments and transformed operations of survivors, testifies to the continuing appeal of institutions, providing spaces where people gather to drink, socialize, conduct business, celebrate occasions, commiserate misfortunes, discuss politics, watch sports, play games, eat meals, and engage in the countless other activities that pubs have accommodated across their long history, demonstrating that public drinking establishments continue fulfilling important social needs that market forces alone cannot satisfy, but that require physical spaces and social institutions facilitating the human interactions and communal experiences that pubs have provided throughout their millennia-long association with English culture. The relationship between pubs and the brewing industry underwent continuous evolution, shaped by technological innovations, including refrigeration, that enabled year-round brewing and distribution of consistent products regardless of seasonal temperature variations that had previously limited brewing to cooler months, pasteurization that extended shelf life and enabled distribution across greater distances without spoilage, pressurized dispensing systems that simplified cellar management while changing beer characteristics, and automated production processes that increased efficiency while reducing labor requirements and enabling brewers to produce standardized products at scales impossible using traditional craft methods. The development of national distribution networks during the 20th century enabled major brewers to supply tied houses across England with products brewed at centralized facilities, creating logistical systems that required sophisticated transportation infrastructure, including railway connections, motorized delivery vehicles, and eventually computerized inventory management that coordinated production, distribution, and retail sales across extensive geographic areas. The decline of regional brewers during the mid-20th century resulted partly from their inability to match the economies of scale achieved by national brewers, whose larger production volumes enabled them to spread fixed costs across greater output, while investing in modern equipment that improved efficiency and reduced unit costs, creating competitive advantages that regional brewers operating older facilities at smaller scales could not match without substantial capital investments that many lacked resources to undertake. The taxation of alcohol represented a significant revenue source for governments throughout English history, with duties on beer and spirits generating substantial public revenues that created fiscal incentives for governments to maintain viable brewing industries, while discouraging excessive consumption through taxation that raised prices above what unrestricted markets would produce, balancing revenue objectives against public health concerns and temperance movement pressures to reduce alcohol availability through prohibitive taxation or outright prohibition. The beer duty structure underwent numerous modifications, reflecting changing policy priorities, economic conditions, and political pressures from brewing industries seeking tax relief, temperance advocates demanding higher duties, and treasury officials managing government finances, requiring substantial revenues from reliable sources, including alcohol taxation, whose inelastic demand characteristics made it particularly suitable for revenue generation, despite social fine-day costs associated with excessive drinking. The differential taxation of on-premises and off-premises alcohol sales influenced consumption patterns by making pub drinking relatively more expensive than home consumption of supermarket-purchased alcohol, contributing to declining pub attendance as price-sensitive consumers shifted consumption toward cheaper off-premises sources. whose lower prices reflected both lower tax rates and economies of scale in retail distribution that supermarkets achieved through high-volume sales and centralized distribution systems that pub operators could not match. The gender dynamics of pub culture evolved substantially from medieval alewives, who dominated small-scale brewing and retail through Victorian separate entrances and compartments designed to segregate female customers from male-dominated public bars, to late 20th century, increasing acceptance of women as ordinary pub customers, rather than exceptional presences requiring special accommodations or suspicious scrutiny. Though gender-based differences in pub usage patterns persisted, with women typically drinking less frequently than men, consuming smaller quantities, preferring different beverage types, and exhibiting different social behaviors that reflected broader gender roles and expectations, extending beyond pub culture to encompass wider social patterns. The Victorian ideology of separate spheres that assigned women to domestic spaces and men to public domains, including pubs, created cultural barriers to female pub attendance that licensing authorities and temperance advocates reinforced, through regulations and social pressures discouraging respectable women from frequenting establishments associated with male working-class culture and moral degradation, creating stigma around female pub-going that persisted into the 20th century, despite gradual relaxation of Victorian-era restrictions and changing attitudes toward women's public presence. The provision of ladies' rooms or snugs in Victorian pubs acknowledged female customers, while simultaneously segregating them from male-dominated public bars, creating separate spaces that protected women's reputations, while allowing them to purchase drinks without directly entering male-dominated areas that would compromise their respectability, though these arrangements also reinforced gender segregation and limited women's access to pub culture on equal terms with male customers. The increasing acceptance of women as pub customers during the mid-20th century reflected broader social changes, including women's wartime employment, increasing economic independence, changing gender roles, and weakening of Victorian moral strictures that had stigmatized female drinking in public establishments. Though full gender equality in pub culture remained incomplete, as subtle forms of discrimination and harassment persisted alongside more overt barriers that earlier generations had faced. The development of wine bars and lounge bars during the 1960s and 70s partly reflected efforts to create drinking establishments more welcoming to female customers than traditional pubs, whose male-dominated atmospheres and associations with working-class masculinity deterred many women from patronizing them. Though these alternative formats also reflected class distinctions, as wine bars attracted middle-class customers who preferred wine to beer and valued more refined atmospheres than traditional pubs provided. The contemporary situation sees women comprising substantial proportions of pub customers in most establishments, though gender-based differences persist in drinking patterns, beverage preferences, and social behaviors that reflect continuing gender distinctions in broader society, despite decades of progress toward gender equality in pub culture and other domains. The relationship between pubs and sports developed extensively during the 19th and 20th centuries, as establishments became important venues for discussing sporting events, organizing amateur sports teams, screening televised competitions, and providing spaces where sports enthusiasts gathered to share interests and allegiances that transcended individual attendance at actual sporting contests. The tradition of pub sports teams in football, cricket, darts, pool, and numerous other competitions created organizational structures connecting establishments to wider sporting cultures, while generating customer loyalty among team members and supporters who patronized pubs fielding teams they followed, participated in, creating social bonds that extended beyond casual drinking to encompass competitive activities and team identities that participants valued sufficiently to maintain regular attendance and participation, despite obligations competing for their time and resources. The introduction of television to pubs during the mid-20th century created new functions as screening venues for sporting events that customers wished to watch communally rather than privately in their homes, with major competitions including World Cup football matches, boxing title fights, and other significant sporting contests drawing crowds to establishments with television sets that many households lacked during the early television era, though this function declined somewhat as television ownership became universal and home viewing became the norm for most sports programming, except events where communal viewing added value that solitary home watching could not provide. The development of sports pubs during the late 20th century created specialized establishments designed specifically for sports viewing, with multiple large-screen televisions displaying different events simultaneously, creating environments optimized for sports consumption that traditional pubs without extensive television infrastructure could not match. Though critics complained that constant sports programming created atmospheres unconducive to conversation and transformed pubs into sports bars that served different primary functions than traditional drinking establishments where conversation, rather than passive viewing, constituted the main activity. The subscription to satellite and cable television services carrying premium sports content represented significant expenses for publicans, but enabled them to attract customers willing to pay premium prices for drinks consumed while watching sporting events unavailable through free-to-air broadcasting, creating business models where sports programming served as loss leader or core attraction generating customer traffic that would not otherwise materialize. Though dependence on sports viewership created vulnerabilities when events concluded or when technological changes enabled customers to access similar content through streaming services in their homes, without requiring physical presence in pubs. The musical traditions associated with pubs encompassed informal singing sessions where customers entertained each other through spontaneous performances, organized music hall, entertainments that evolved from pub concert rooms into major commercial entertainment industries, folk music sessions, preserving traditional repertoires, jazz performances, introducing American musical forms to English audiences, rock and pop concerts, showcasing emerging talent, and numerous other musical activities that made pubs important venues for musical performance and consumption across diverse genres and performance contexts. The tradition of pub singing that flourished during the 19th century created participatory musical cultures where customers knew common songs and joined in communal singing that required no professional musicians or formal entertainment, but emerged spontaneously from drinking groups whose members possessed sufficient knowledge of popular repertoires to participate in collective singing that strengthened social bonds while entertaining participants, observers. Though changing musical tastes and the rise of recorded music gradually eroded traditions of participatory pub singing, as customers increasingly expected professional entertainment rather than providing amusement themselves. The folk music revival of the 1950s and 60s revitalized pub-based musical traditions through the establishment of folk clubs, meeting regularly in pubs where musicians performed traditional songs and tunes for audiences, appreciating acoustic music and traditional repertoires that mainstream commercial music industries largely ignored, creating alternative musical spaces where traditional forms survived and flourished despite their marginalization in commercial music markets, dominated by rock, pop, and other contemporary styles. The role of pubs as venues for emerging musical talent provided performance opportunities for musicians lacking access to larger concert halls or recording contracts, with pub gigs enabling performers to develop skills, build followings, and test new material before small audiences in informal settings that tolerated experimentation and imperfection that larger commercial venues would not accept, creating developmental spaces where musicians honed their craft while earning modest compensation that supplemented other income sources and enabled them to pursue musical careers that might not otherwise be economically viable. The installation of jukeboxes during the mid-20th century introduced recorded music to pubs that previously featured only live performances or silence, creating soundscapes that enabled customers to select music according to their preferences, while generating revenues for publicans through coin-operated mechanisms that charged for each played recording. Though jukeboxes also generated controversies when customers disagreed about musical selections or when volume levels interfered with conversation that many customers valued more than background music. The later development of digital music systems and streaming services replaced physical jukeboxes with networked systems offering vastly larger musical libraries and more sophisticated selection mechanisms, while eliminating the mechanical charm and tactile engagement that characterized earlier jukeboxes, whose physical presence and mechanical operations created aesthetics and interactions that digital systems could not replicate despite their superior technical capabilities. And vastly expanded musical catalogues. The architectural preservation of pub buildings confronted challenges, including economic pressures, favoring demolition or conversion to more profitable uses, changing consumer preferences, demanding modernization that compromised historical features, inadequate maintenance by neglectful owners, allowing buildings to deteriorate to points where restoration became prohibitively expensive, and regulatory frameworks that sometimes failed to provide sufficient protection against destructive alterations or demolitions that eliminated architecturally significant structures before preservation advocates could mobilize effective opposition. The listing of pub buildings as structures of special architectural or historical interest provided legal protection requiring consent for alterations or demolitions, though listing did not guarantee preservation, as economic pressures might lead owners to allow listed buildings to deteriorate deliberately to points where demolition could be justified as necessary due to structural failures, resulting from neglect that listing authorities had insufficient resources to prevent through enforcement actions compelling proper maintenance. The establishment of pub heritage groups documenting and advocating for architecturally significant pubs raised public awareness while providing information to listing authorities considering protection applications, creating networks of expertise and advocacy that identified threatened buildings and mobilized preservation campaigns that sometimes succeeded in preventing destructive alterations or demolitions that would have eliminated important examples of pub architecture. The adaptive reuse of historic pub buildings for continued pub operations required sensitive interventions that balance preservation of significant architectural features against functional requirements of contemporary operations, including accessibility for disabled customers, fire safety systems, commercial kitchen facilities, storage areas, and other operational necessities that historic structures might not adequately accommodate without modifications that potentially compromised architectural integrity if implemented insensitively. The tension between preservation and functionality created challenges for owners attempting to operate viable businesses in listed buildings, whose protected status restricted alterations, while operational requirements demanded changes to accommodate contemporary standards and customer expectations that designers of original buildings had not anticipated when creating structures for 19th century pub operations that differed substantially from contemporary such instantly requirements. The successful navigation of these tensions required sophisticated understanding of both historical architecture and contemporary operational requirements, combined with willingness to invest resources in creative solutions that achieved functional objectives while respecting architectural significance, creating preservation outcomes that maintained historical character while enabling continued use that provided economic justification for maintenance investments that pure preservation without functional use might not generate. The urban planning context within which pubs operated influenced their locations, functions, and viability through zoning regulations that might prohibit or restrict pub operations in residential areas, transportation infrastructure that determined accessibility, surrounding land uses that created compatible or conflicting contexts, and redevelopment policies that might encourage or discourage pub retention in areas undergoing transformation. The suburbanization of English cities during the 20th century created new pub locations in developing residential areas, while potentially reducing demand for urban pubs as populations dispersed from traditional urban neighborhoods to suburban communities whose residents exhibited different social patterns and leisure preferences than urban populations had maintained, creating geographic shifts in pub locations and functions that reflected broader urban restructuring processes. The decline of traditional urban neighborhoods through slum clearance programs, industrial decline, and population dispersal eliminated many urban pubs whose customer bases disappeared when redevelopment destroyed established communities and dispersed residents to distant suburbs or peripheral estates, lacking the density and pedestrian orientation that had supported neighborhood pubs in traditional urban districts. creating patterns of pub closures concentrated in areas experiencing urban transformation and population loss. The gentrification of formerly working-class urban neighborhoods during the late 20th and early 21st centuries created mixed effects on pub culture, as rising property values, increased rents, and property taxes that pressured publicans while potentially generating more affluent customer bases willing to pay premium prices for superior offerings, creating opportunities for pubs adapting to changing demographics while threatening establishments unable or unwilling to transform operations to suit new populations. The conversion of former industrial buildings and warehouses into residential lofts and commercial spaces created new urban populations, potentially supporting pubs in areas that had previously lacked residential populations outside working hours. Though the social profiles and leisure preferences of gentrifying populations often differed from traditional working-class communities, requiring pubs to adapt offerings and atmospheres to attract newcomers whose tastes and expectations might not align with traditional pub formats. The conflicts between long-established pubs and newly arrived residents complaining about noise and disorder illustrated tensions between competing uses and expectations that urban planning frameworks struggled to mediate satisfactorily, with noise complaints potentially leading to restrictions on pub operations that threatened viability, while residents asserted rights to quiet enjoyment of properties they had purchased in areas where pubs had operated for decades or centuries before residential conversions brought new populations into proximity with established drinking establishments. The role of pubs in fostering social capital and community cohesion attracted attention from social researchers, investigating the mechanisms through which drinking establishments contributed to neighborhood vitality and residents' quality of life, with studies documenting how regular pub attendance created social networks, facilitated information exchange, supported mutual assistance among neighbors, and generated senses of belonging and community identity that isolated individuals lacking pub connections might not develop. The concept of the pub as third place, distinct from home and workplace, recognized drinking establishments as important social spaces where individuals encountered neighbors and acquaintances in informal contexts that fostered relationships difficult to develop through more formal or structured interactions, creating social capital that benefited individuals through enhanced access to information, assistance, and companionship, while benefiting communities through strengthened social bonds and collective efficacy that enabled neighborhood residents to address common problems cooperatively. The decline of traditional neighborhood pubs potentially eroded social capital and community cohesion in areas where pub closures eliminated important social infrastructure that other institutions might not adequately replace, creating social deficits that affected community functioning in ways that extended beyond the immediate loss of drinking establishments to encompass broader social consequences, including increased isolation, weakened neighborhood ties, and reduced capacity for collective action. The public health perspectives on pub culture emphasize the health consequences of alcohol consumption, including immediate risks from intoxication and long-term harms from chronic heavy drinking, creating tensions between public health advocates seeking to reduce alcohol-related harms through restrictions on pub operations and defenders of pub culture, emphasizing the social benefits of drinking establishments and questioning whether public health goals justified substantial restrictions on traditional institutions serving important social functions beyond alcohol provision. The recognition that drinking patterns varied substantially among individuals created more nuanced public health approaches, distinguishing between moderate drinkers experiencing minimal harms and heavy drinkers suffering serious health consequences, while attempting to design interventions reducing harms among problem drinkers without unnecessarily restricting moderate consumption by majority of drinkers who did not experience significant health problems. From there, drinking, the minimum unit pricing proposals that gained support during the early 21st century represented public health interventions designed to reduce consumption among heavy drinkers who purchased cheapest alcohol products while minimally affecting moderate drinkers willing to pay somewhat higher prices for drinks. Though pub operators complained that minimum pricing raised supermarket alcohol prices without corresponding increases in pub prices, potentially narrowing price differentials between on-premises and off-premises purchases. without fully eliminating the substantial price gap that directed price-sensitive customers toward off-premises sources. The environmental sustainability of pub operations attracted increasing attention as concerns about climate change and resource depletion prompted examinations of the environmental impacts of brewing, distribution, and retail operations, with initiatives including local sourcing to reduce transportation distances, energy efficiency improvements to reduce carbon emissions, waste reduction and recycling programs, water conservation measures, and sustainable building practices in new construction and renovations aimed at reducing environmental footprints while potentially generating cost savings through reduced resource consumption and waste disposal expenses. The local sourcing emphasis within craft beer movements aligned environmental sustainability with economic benefits for local suppliers and cultural values, emphasizing connection to place and community, creating multiple rationales for practices that reduced environmental impacts while supporting local economies and creating distinctive products reflecting local ingredients and traditions that mass-produced national brands could not match. The tension between single-use containers, including bottles and cans that created substantial waste streams, despite recycling programs and reusable containers, including cask ale systems and growlers that reduced packaging waste but required more complex logistics and cleaning procedures, illustrated trade-offs between convenience and environmental sustainability that characterize many aspects of contemporary pub operations, where traditional practices sometimes proved more environmentally sustainable than modern alternatives, emphasizing convenience and standardization. The technological changes affecting pub operations included electronic payment systems that reduced cash handling while creating transaction records that simplified accounting and tax compliance, digital marketing and social media that enabled publicans to communicate with customers and promote events without relying on traditional advertising, online booking systems that facilitated table reservations and event planning, inventory management software that tracked stock levels and simplified ordering, and point-of-sale systems that integrated multiple operational functions, including sales tracking, inventory management, staff scheduling, and financial reporting in comprehensive platforms that provided operational insights previously unavailable without extensive manual record keeping. The adoption of these technologies required capital investments that might burden small operators, lacking resources for substantial technology expenditures, while creating ongoing costs for software subscriptions, equipment maintenance, and technical support that represented new expense categories not present in traditional pub operations, relying on manual processes and minimal technology beyond refrigeration and draft systems. The digital divide between technologically sophisticated operations and traditional pubs, maintaining older operational methods, created competitive disparities, as customers increasingly expected technological conveniences, including online ordering, contactless payment, and digital communications that pubs lacking appropriate systems could not provide, potentially disadvantaging operators unable or unwilling to invest in technological modernization that younger customers particularly expected based on their experiences with technology-enabled retail and hospitality services in other sectors. The educational functions of pubs extended beyond informal knowledge exchange among customers to encompass more structured educational activities, including lecture series, book clubs, language classes, craft workshops, and various other organized learning opportunities that publicans hosted to attract customers and provide community services, while generating revenues from drink sales to participants, whose attendance provided both educational benefits and social opportunities that combined learning with leisure in ways that purely educational institutions might not facilitate. The tradition of pub quizzes that became widespread during the late 20th century created competitive intellectual activities that attracted teams of regular participants who valued the combination of mental challenge, social interaction, and drinking in weekly events that provided structure and purpose to pub attendance, while generating reliable customer traffic on slow weekday evenings that might not otherwise attract sufficient customers to justify opening. The role of pubs as spaces for political discussion and debate, dating from medieval times through contemporary periods, reflected their status as public spaces where individuals could express opinions and engage with differing viewpoints in environments that tolerated robust exchanges that more formal or restricted settings might not permit, creating democratic functions that extended beyond electoral politics to encompass broader civic discourse through which citizens developed political consciousness and engaged with public affairs through conversations conducted over drinks, in establishments accessible to common people, regardless of education or social status. The complex interrelationships among the regional, architectural, literary, economic, social, brewing, legal, international, gender, sporting, musical, preservation, planning, health, environmental, technological, and educational dimensions of pub culture collectively demonstrate that drinking establishments constitute multifaceted institutions whose significance extends across numerous domains of English life, creating complexity that defies simple characterizations or analyses, focusing narrowly on single aspects, while ignoring the broader contexts within which pubs operated and the multiple functions they performed simultaneously, requiring comprehensive approaches that recognize the interconnections among different dimensions and examine how changes in one area influence developments in others through systemic relationships that created pub culture as integrated whole rather than collection of separate elements that could be understood in isolation from each other, ultimately revealing pubs as remarkable institutions that adapted continuously to changing conditions while maintaining core functions and characteristics that enabled them to persist across centuries of dramatic transformation in English society, economy, politics, and culture, demonstrating resilience and flexibility that positioned them to continue serving important roles in English life, despite ongoing challenges and uncertainties about their future trajectories. The commemorative functions of pubs included serving as sites of memory where communities gathered to mark significant occasions, remember departed members, celebrate achievements, and maintain connections to shared pasts that gave neighborhoods and social groups coherent identities extending across generations, with regular customers developing histories of association with particular establishments that became part of personal and collective biographies, whose significance exceeded the simple facts of drinking in specific locations by incorporating meanings related to friendship, community, belonging, and continuity that transformed mundane activities into symbolically laden practices whose importance derived from accumulated associations rather than inherent qualities of drinking itself. The memorial plaques, photographs, trophies, and other material culture displayed in pubs created visual archives, documenting establishment histories and communities that patronized them, preserving memories that might otherwise be lost, while creating environments rich with historical resonances that connected contemporary patrons to predecessors, whose presences remained palpable through material traces left behind, creating senses of historical depth and continuity that distinguished pubs with long histories from newly established venues, lacking accumulated associations and material cultures that required decades to develop. The tradition of naming pubs after historical events, figures, or symbols created connections to broader English history while reflecting the periods during which establishments were founded or renamed, with names including the Royal Oak, commemorating King Charles II's escape from parliamentarian forces, the Lord Nelson, honouring the naval hero, and countless other historically significant names that situated individual establishments within larger national narratives while serving as reminders of historical episodes that contemporary Englishmen might otherwise forget or neglect. The relationship between pubs and the hospitality industry more broadly involved competition and cooperation with restaurants, hotels, cafes, and other establishments serving overlapping markets while offering different combinations of services and atmospheres that appeal to different customer segments or satisfy different needs that individual customers experienced at different times or in different contexts, creating complex competitive landscapes where establishments cooperated in some respects while competing in others, depending on specific situations and customer requirements. The blurring of distinctions between pubs and restaurants as food service became increasingly central to pub operations, created definitional ambiguities about whether establishments primarily serving meals with alcohol as accompaniment, rather than alcohol, with minimal food-constituted pubs or restaurants occupying buildings historically used as pubs, raising questions about essential characteristics, defining pub identity, and whether food-focused operations represented legitimate evolution of pub concepts or fundamental transformations, creating different business types that happen to occupy former pub premises. The gastropub phenomenon, beginning in the 1990s, attempted to synthesize pub and restaurant concepts by offering high-quality food in informal pub settings, creating hybrid establishments that appeal to customers desiring better food than traditional pub offerings provided, while preferring casual pub atmospheres over more formal restaurant environments. Though critics questioned whether gastropubs represented authentic pubs or merely restaurants borrowing pub aesthetics, while abandoning the democratic accessibility and unpretentious character that traditionally defined pub culture in favor of more exclusive and expensive operations, catering to affluent customers willing to pay restaurant prices in pub settings. The seasonal rhythms of pub operations reflected agricultural calendars in rural areas, where harvest periods and market days created peak demand periods, while winter months brought reduced activity as agricultural work slowed. Discretionary spending declined, creating annual cycles that publicans accommodated through adjustments to staffing, inventory, and hours that match supply to predictably varying demand patterns. The urban pubs, serving industrial populations, experienced different seasonal patterns, shaped by employment cycles, weather conditions affecting workers' desires to socialize after shifts, holiday periods when factories closed temporarily, and other factors, creating demand variations that differed from agricultural seasonal patterns while still producing rhythms that publicans recognized and adapted operations to accommodate. The development of year-round tourism in some regions created more stable demand patterns that reduced seasonal variation and enabled pubs to maintain consistent operations and staffing throughout the year, rather than scaling up and down according to seasonal fluctuations. Though weather still influenced daily and weekly patterns, as outdoor beer gardens attracted more customers during pleasant weather, while poor conditions kept potential customers at home or reduced the time they spent in establishments. After arriving, the evolution of pub games from traditional pastimes, including skittles, shove-halfpenny, cribbage, and dominoes that had been played in alehouses for centuries through the introduction of darts, pool tables, and electronic gaming machines, reflected changing leisure preferences and commercial pressures to generate revenues beyond beverage sales, with gaming machines particularly controversial due to associations with problem gambling and concerns that they transformed pub atmospheres from conversation-centered social spaces into gambling venues whose beeping machines and flashing lights created environments, discouraging the face-to-face interactions that had traditionally characterized pub culture. The darts phenomenon that became integral to British pub culture during the 20th century created an accessible game, requiring minimal equipment and space, while enabling players of varying skill levels to compete on relatively equal terms, with pub darts leagues organizing regular competitions that fostered community rivalries and created structures of competitive play that generated regular customers who attended both their own matches and those featuring teams they followed. The decline of some traditional pub games, including skittles and shove-halfpenny, reflected changing preferences and the physical requirements for these games that many modern pubs could not accommodate due to space constraints in smaller establishments or landlord reluctance to dedicate valuable floor space to games that generated no direct revenue beyond attracting customers who might drink while playing. The relationship between pubs and organized crime occasionally involved establishments serving as meeting places for criminals, venues for illegal gambling operations, outlets for stolen goods, or fronts for money laundering activities that exploited cash-intensive businesses whose transaction records might be manipulated to disguise illicit revenues. Though the extent of criminal pub involvement remained limited, with vast majority of establishments operating legally, while small minorities became entangled in criminal activities that generated sensational publicity, disproportionate to their actual prevalence. The regulation of pubs aimed partly at preventing criminal activity through licensing requirements that excluded convicted criminals from holding licenses, police supervision of establishments suspected of harboring criminal elements, and enforcement actions against publicans permitting illegal activities on their premises, though the effectiveness of these regulatory efforts varied depending on resource availability, police priorities, and practical difficulties of detecting and proving criminal activities occurring in establishments whose ordinary operations provided cover for illicit transactions that looked superficially similar to legal business. The portrayal of criminal pubs in literature and film created cultural associations between certain types of establishments and criminality that influenced public perceptions while providing atmospheric settings for crime narratives that exploited pub associations with working-class culture and moral ambiguity, creating fictional representations that sometimes bore limited resemblance to actual criminal pub involvement, but proved dramatically effective in creating tension and atmosphere in crime stories. The culmination of these diverse perspectives demonstrates that English pub culture represents one of the most complex and enduring social institutions in English history, adapting across centuries while maintaining essential characteristics that enable drinking establishments to serve continuously as important social spaces, despite dramatic transformations in the broader society surrounding them, creating remarkable continuity amidst profound change as pubs evolved from medieval alehouses through Victorian gin palaces to contemporary craft beer venues, while maintaining core functions related to social gathering, community building, and the provision of spaces where people from diverse backgrounds could encounter each other on relatively equal terms, making pub history inseparable from broader English social history, while exhibiting distinctive characteristics and developmental patterns that reflected the specific requirements and possibilities of commercial drinking. Establishments, ultimately creating institutions whose complexity, adaptability, and social significance established them as among the most important and enduring elements of English culture, whose continued vitality and evolution ensure that pubs will remain central features of English life, even as their specific forms and functions continue adapting to meet the changing needs and preferences of contemporary populations who value the social opportunities and communal experiences that public drinking spaces have provided throughout the long history of time. English pubs. The examination of pub culture through these complementary lenses reveals an institution remarkable for its adaptability, while retaining core characteristics that maintained continuity across many centuries, demonstrating that pubs succeeded in remaining relevant through flexibility in accommodating new social patterns, economic structures, cultural practices, and regulatory requirements, without abandoning fundamental functions of providing public spaces where people could gather socially over drinks, creating institutional resilience that positioned pubs to continue playing important roles in English social life for many centuries. Despite persistent challenges that eliminated many other traditional institutions in modern Britain, today,